What I am about to share with you should have remained buried beneath the mountain soil. For 7 years I kept this silence, not out of fear of disbelief, but fear of what speaking it aloud might awaken. The authorities closed the case. They filed the incident reports. They even removed me from duty, claiming stress and exhaustion. But the truth still walks the trails of Appalachia after dark, wearing faces that do not belong to any living thing. Before we go further, please subscribe to this channel. What you are about to hear exists in the archive of this place, a record that must be preserved. Turn on notifications. You will want to hear what comes next. My name is irrelevant to this story. What matters is that I was a ranger in the southern Appalachian wilderness for 23 years. What matters is that I saw things that the Park Service would rather forget. And what matters is that you understand what lurks in those fog-draped hollers is far older than the mountains themselves. The job had always been solitary. That is what I liked about it. You are alone with the trees, with the stone, with the history compressed into every inch of that ancient range. The Appalachian Mountains carry memories older than nations. The indigenous peoples who walked those ridges for thousands of years left something behind. Not graves, not settlements, but something that never quite left. I began my tenure in 2001. The same year the world seemed to fracture, while cities burned and governments scrambled. I was deep in the wilderness, maintaining trails and monitoring the health of those sacred peaks. The Appalachian Range is different from other mountains. It feels alive in ways that western peaks never do. The fog clings to the hollows not as weather, but as intention. The mist moves with purpose. The first unusual occurrence happened in my 5th year of service. I was conducting a perimeter check in the northern sector, an area called the Broken Ridge, named long ago by settlers who claimed the mountains there seemed to splinter into impossible angles. The trail winds through dense hemlocks, where daylight barely penetrates even at noon. That is when I encountered the first group of them. They appeared on the trail ahead of me, but not in any conventional way. It was as though they simply resolved into visibility, like a photograph developing in a dark room. There were 5 figures, all impossibly thin. Their forms outlined against the dimness of the forest in a way that seemed to cast their own shadow backward. Their skin was the color of charcoal, not black, but the residual darkness left after fire consumes everything. I should have been afraid. Standard protocol would demand retreat and reporting. But I was paralyzed not by fear but by recognition. Something in their bearing, in the way they held themselves in perfect stillness, spoke to an understanding that predated my own consciousness. They stood there, watching me, their heads tilted at angles that seemed to exceed the normal range of human anatomy. Then the smallest one, it could not have been more than 4 feet tall, raised one arm toward me. The movement was not threatening. It was an invitation. It was a warning. It was something else entirely that my mind could not classify. I fled. I ran back down that trail with my radio raised and my voice hoarse, but by the time I could form words, they were gone. And when I reached the location on my return, I found only my own footprints. The ground where they stood showed no impressions at all. No footfall, no displacement of leaves, no evidence that anything had ever occupied that space. My supervisor, John Matthews, listened to my report with the patience of a man accustomed to wilderness workers encountering stress and isolation. He recommended a week off. He also recommended speaking with a counselor. Neither of those things made the figures disappear from my memory. In the following months, I began cataloging the encounters. There was no pattern at first, but by autumn, I realized they only appeared when I was alone, and they only appeared on the oldest trails, those that followed routes established centuries before the park itself existed. Routes that aligned with the pathways used by the mountain peoples for generations beyond counting. By 2006, I had documented 12 separate encounters, each one different. Sometimes they stood motionless, sometimes they seemed to flicker at the edges of vision, existing in multiple positions simultaneously. Once, one of them spoke, though I cannot accurately describe what I heard. It was not words in any human language. It was something that resonated in the bones themselves. A vibratory instruction that my conscious mind translated into scattered images. Smoke, sacred ground, blood on stone, voices singing in registers that human throats cannot produce. I began to keep detailed journals. I even considered leaving, but some part of me understood that these encounters were a trust. I was being shown something. I was being tested. I was being reminded of something that the Park Service and the federal government and the modern world had all tried to forget. that these mountains belonged to something older, something that had never agreed to the treaties or the boundaries or the casual recreation of millions of visitors every year. In the summer of 2007, I finally saw their true numbers. I was hiking the Sentinel Trail, a route that runs along the highest ridge of the park, offering views of 3 states on clear days. I had started before dawn, wanting to reach the summit observation point before the morning crowds, but on that particular morning, the fog was absolute. It rose from the valleys like something alive, like breath exhaled from the earth itself. Halfway up the climb, I realized I was not alone. They emerged from the mist in perfect formation, not walking, but drifting through the vertical space between the trees. I counted 17 of them. Some were the size of children, some were impossibly tall, their shapes stretching upward until they seemed to thin into the fog itself. All of them wore the same charcoal darkness, the same backward-casting shadow. They moved in perfect synchronization, forming patterns that reminded me of formations I had seen in ancient texts, diagrams from indigenous creation stories, constellation maps, architectural blueprints of sacred spaces. They were showing me something. They were showing me the structure of their presence. I stood absolutely still. I did not run this time. Instead, I waited. And as I waited, the smallest of them approached. It had a face, or at least the suggestion of one. Where features should have been, there was only the outline of a profile cut from absolute darkness. The creature bent toward me, and I understood then what the old peoples had known all along. These were not animals or demons or illusions of my fractured mind. These were the residue of something sacred. They were the imprints left by the ones who had been here first, who had walked these mountains with intention and ceremony and understanding. They were the echo that could never quite disappear because the mountains themselves refused to forget. In that moment, I received what I can only describe as knowledge, not spoken, not written, but simply inserted into my consciousness like data flooding a corrupted hard drive. I saw the rituals, I saw the gatherings. I saw thousands of these shadow forms assembled on night-darkened peaks, singing in voices that made the stone itself vibrate. I saw the old stories made visible. I saw the price of forgetting. Then the fog thickened, and they were gone. I made it back to the ranger station that afternoon. My hands were shaking. My clothing was soaked through with perspiration despite the cool mountain air. John took one look at me and insisted I sit down. He poured me coffee that had been sitting since morning, and I drank it without tasting it. I did not tell him about the 17 figures. I did not tell him about the visions. Instead, I told him I had encountered a bear on the trail and that it had been an aggressive encounter, though I had managed to retreat safely. He believed me, or at least he acted as though he did. He filed an incident report and made a note that I should be paired with another ranger for a while. That was the first lie I would tell about these encounters. But it would not be the last. By August of 2009, other people began to see them. The first external report came from a family of hikers, the Hendersons, who claimed to have encountered a group of unusually thin and pale individuals on the Eagle Ridge Trail. They described the figures as ghostly and unnatural in their proportions. The family had a teenage son named Caleb, who was 17 at the time. He provided the most detailed account. The figures had not acknowledged the family but had simply stood to the side of the trail, watching with an intensity that made his skin crawl. When the family turned back to look at them, they were gone. Management wanted to dismiss it as a misidentification, perhaps hikers in unusual clothing, perhaps some kind of optical illusion created by the fog. But I knew better. The fact that they were revealing themselves to others suggested a shift in their purpose. They were no longer content with private visitations. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted the mountain to acknowledge what had been forgotten. Over the next 2 years, sightings accumulated. In 2010, a group of 8 young people reported seeing shadow creatures moving through the forest near the Widow's Hollow campground. Their names were recorded: Ryan Sanders, Stella Price, Nathan Bennett, Lucy Wood, Isaac Barnes, Aurora Ross, Ellie Coleman, and Thomas Jenkins. They were teenagers and young adults, ranging from 16 to 22 years old. They had been camping in an area that officially should have been closed due to a rockfall, though the closure signs had been repeatedly vandalized and removed. The young people's accounts were remarkably consistent. They described the creatures as moving with a jerking, unnatural gait, as though their joints bent in directions that human anatomy did not permit. They described the sensation of wrongness that emanated from the creatures, a palpable wrongness that made the air itself feel thick and difficult to breathe. And they described the sounds, a kind of humming or keening that seemed to vibrate in the base of the skull, a sound that lingered in the mind even after the creatures had vanished. Several of the group reported missing time. After encountering the creatures, they found that hours had passed, hours they could not account for. Ryan Sanders claimed that he had looked at his phone to check the time while watching the creatures approach their camp, and the device had shown 11:47 p.m. When the creatures retreated back into the forest, his phone indicated 3:32 a.m. Yet to Ryan and the others, it had felt like no more than a few minutes had elapsed. I was brought in for questioning by a regional official named Deputy Morris. He wanted to know if I had ever encountered anything like the descriptions provided by the hikers. I told him that the mountains sometimes played tricks on people's perceptions, that fog and isolation could create powerful hallucinations, that there were known geological formations in some areas that could create unusual optical effects when light struck them at particular angles. None of this was untrue, but it was not the truth either. What I knew and could not say was this: the creatures were not hallucinating. The creatures were not tricks of perception. The creatures were becoming more present, more material, more willing to breach the invisible membrane that separated their existence from ours. And the camping young people had violated a boundary that my people, the original people of these mountains, had established centuries ago. The closure signs that had been repeatedly torn down were not there by accident. The restriction on camping in Widow's Hollow was not bureaucratic excess. It was a containment measure, a way of respecting the space where the shadow people gathered most frequently. That area, I would later learn, had been the site of a major ceremonial ground for the people who had inhabited these mountains before the government set aside land for a park. It was sacred ground, even if that sacredness had been officially erased from the record. That autumn, I made a decision that would define the next 7 years of my life. I began researching the history of the park, not the official history, but the deeper history, the history that existed in fragments and oral accounts, and in the memories of families whose ancestors had never agreed to leave the mountains. I found an elder named Thomas. I will not provide his full name or tribal affiliation for his protection. He lived in a small town at the edge of the park boundary, in a house that seemed to exist slightly outside of normal time, all weathered wood and windows that reflected light in strange angles. Thomas was in his 90s when I met him, but his eyes held the clarity of someone whose mind was as sharp as the mountain stone. I told him about the shadow figures. I did not expect him to believe me. Instead, he nodded slowly and invited me inside. His house smelled of cedar and smoke, and the walls were covered with photographs and documents and drawings, a visual archive of the mountain people and their history. Thomas showed me pictures of ceremonies conducted centuries ago, rituals that incorporated darkness and shadow as sacred elements. He showed me diagrams of formation patterns that matched exactly what I had witnessed in the fog. He showed me texts describing the shadow people not as demons or spirits, but as something far older and more complex. They were the vessel forms of the mountain's memory, the psychic residue of sacred practices conducted for thousands of years. According to Thomas and the traditions he shared with me, the shadow people had always been present in these mountains. They were not separate entities that could be killed or driven away. They were aspects of the land itself, manifestations of the collective consciousness that the indigenous people had cultivated through ceremony and intention. When the people were forced from the mountains, through broken treaties and military violence and systematic erasure, the shadow people did not disappear. Instead, they became more vulnerable. They became more prone to manifestation. They became more likely to breach into the reality of ordinary people. The increasing sightings were not a sign that the creatures were becoming more active. They were a sign that the land itself was in distress, calling out, trying to remind the world of what had been taken from it. Thomas asked me a question that I have never forgotten. Do you know why you can see them, the way others cannot? Do you understand what that means? I told him I did not understand, and he replied, because the mountain knows you listen. Because you have walked the old trails with respect, because somewhere in your bloodline you carry the memory of a people who came before. The shadow people are not showing themselves to you as a curse. They are showing themselves to you as a responsibility. By the time I left Thomas's house that evening, I had accepted a role I had never consciously chosen. I would become a guardian of the boundary between the two worlds. I would learn what I could about the shadow people and their nature, and I would do everything in my power to prevent the kind of tragedy that seemed to be looming on the horizon, because even then I could sense something approaching. The sightings were accelerating. The creatures were becoming bolder, and in the distance, like a sound too low for normal human hearing, I could feel the pressure building. as though something vast and ancient was preparing to erupt. In the spring of 2011, Violet Perry disappeared. She was 25 years old, a graduate student studying ecological forestry at a nearby university. She had a research grant that allowed her to conduct fieldwork in the park, monitoring the health of old-growth hemlock forests. She was brilliant, by all accounts. She was dedicated. She was also unaware of the invisible boundary lines that separated safe territory from the places where the boundary between worlds had grown thin. Violet's last confirmed sighting was on a Tuesday morning when she signed in at the ranger station, indicating that she would be conducting research in the northern sector near the Sentinel Trail. I was on duty that day. I remember the conversation with perfect clarity because every word of it has haunted me for over a decade. She asked me if there were any areas of the park that were experiencing unusual ecological stress. She wanted to understand if climate change or disease was affecting the old forests. I knew exactly which areas she was asking about. The high ridge systems where the oldest trees still stood, the places where the stone itself seemed to breathe with age and accumulated power. I should have warned her. I should have told her that some places in the park were closed to research, not for ecological reasons but for reasons of human safety. I should have explained that the mountain had areas where it was better not to look too closely, better not to disturb the careful equilibrium that had been maintained for generations. Instead, I gave her a map of the Northern Territory and marked off the areas where she should conduct her measurements. She disappeared into the forest that morning and never came back. The search operation that followed was extensive. Park rangers, volunteers, and eventually search and rescue teams combed every inch of the forest where Violet was known to have conducted research. They found her equipment scattered across a 3-mile radius, her field pack, her measuring instruments, her notebook with detailed observations about the hemlock growth patterns she had been studying. But they found no trace of Violet herself. The official reports suggested several possibilities. She had slipped on the steep terrain and fallen into a ravine where her body remained undiscovered. She had suffered a medical episode, a heart attack or stroke, and died in some remote location where rescue teams could not reach her. Or, most darkly, she had deliberately disappeared, having decided to abandon her life and identity. The case remained open but eventually went cold. Violet Perry's family waited for years hoping for any sign of her. The university retired her scholarship in her memory, and I carried the knowledge of my culpability with me like a stone. What had actually happened to Violet, I would not fully understand until much later. But I began to grasp the outlines of the truth when Ryan Sanders brought his friends to the ranger station with a story that they all swore was true, even though it contradicted everything the official search operation had concluded. Ryan was 20 years old now, more confident and articulate than he had been during the initial Shadow People sightings. He had been working seasonally at the park, doing trail maintenance and odd jobs, and he had spent enough time in the forest to develop an instinct for its patterns. One afternoon, while clearing brush near the Widow's Hollow area, he and another seasonal worker, Isaac Barnes, had encountered something extraordinary. They found what appeared to be a doorway. It was located in a cliff face along a remote section of the high ridge, in a spot that was officially mapped as impenetrable terrain. The doorway was not obvious. It had no frame or hinges, no markers indicating it as constructed, but it was unmistakably there. An opening into shadow that seemed to exist deeper than any shadow should exist, a void that pulled the eye downward into impossible perspective. Ryan and Isaac did not attempt to enter the doorway, but they found evidence that someone had. There was a partial footprint in the dust near the opening, a footprint that was far too small to belong to an adult male. And nearby, they found strands of fabric that matched the color of the field vest that Violet Perry had been wearing on the day she disappeared. When Ryan brought this evidence to me, I understood what had happened. Violet had not fallen. She had not suffered a medical episode. She had found one of the doorways, the thin places where the boundary between the human world and the shadow realm had become so attenuated that it was possible to pass through. And she had entered it. Whether she had done so deliberately or accidentally, I would never know. But I understood that the Shadow People were not interested in harming her. They were interested in her knowledge, her mind, her connection to the living world. They needed someone who understood the mechanisms of the forest, the patterns of growth and decay, the complex systems that allowed the mountains to maintain their ecological integrity. In some sense, Violet Perry was still there. She was still conducting her research, but she was conducting it in a place that existed parallel to our own. A place where the rules of physics operated differently and time moved according to patterns that had nothing to do with the rotation of the Earth. This realization changed everything about how I understood my responsibility. I could no longer be a passive observer. I could no longer simply wait and watch and record what was happening. I had to actively intervene. I had to prevent others from stumbling through those thin places, and I had to learn, as quickly as possible, exactly how many of those doorways existed in the park. What began as a solitary project became a comprehensive effort to map the thin places within the park's boundaries. Using the locations where sightings had been reported, combined with the indigenous knowledge that Thomas had shared with me, I identified 17 distinct areas where the boundary between worlds seemed compromised. Not all of these areas contained visible doorways. Some of them existed only as feelings, places where hikers reported an overwhelming sense of dread or wrongness, where compasses failed to function accurately, where time seemed to move at an unusual rate. But others, as Ryan had discovered, possessed actual physical openings, voids in the landscape that seemed to exist deeper than the geology should allow. The most significant doorway was located in a place called the Stone Heart, a depression in the earth where the bedrock formed a perfectly smooth bowl, surrounded by ancient hemlock trees that were estimated to be over 800 years old. According to Thomas, this location had been the primary ceremonial site for the indigenous people who inhabited the mountains. It was where they had conducted rituals designed to maintain the connection between the physical world and the realm of spirits. It was where the boundary between the two worlds was supposed to remain permeable, controlled only by those who understood the proper ceremonies. When the people were removed from the mountains, the ceremonies stopped. The boundary, which had been carefully maintained, began to degrade. The shadow people, cut off from the intentions that had sustained them, began to leak through in uncontrolled ways. I visited the Stone Heart for the first time in the late spring of 2012. I had taken a week of vacation time, the kind of time I told my supervisors I needed to decompress and recuperate from the stresses of the job. The truth was that I needed to understand the Stone Heart for myself. The journey to the location required abandoning the marked trails and navigating cross-country for nearly 3 miles. The terrain became increasingly difficult as I approached the site, not because of any physical obstacle, but because the forest itself seemed to be guiding me toward the location through channels that had been laid down long ago. The trees formed natural corridors. The stone beneath my feet seemed to arrange itself to guide my steps. When I finally emerged into the Stone Heart, I understood why it had been chosen as a ceremonial site. The location was not like any other depression in the landscape. The space seemed to exist in a pocket of stillness that separated it from the surrounding forest. The trees at the boundary of the Stone Heart were unnaturally still. No wind moved their branches, even though wind rattled the high canopy of the surrounding forest. The light that fell into the bowl seemed to originate from no particular direction, not from above, not from any source that I could identify. It was as though the light was inherent to the space itself, and covering the smooth stone floor were marks. Not carved marks, not graffiti. Marks that seemed to have been burned into the stone by some heat so intense it had left no evidence of flame. The marks formed complex geometric patterns that spiraled outward from the center of the bowl in a configuration that reminded me of astronomical charts or the architecture of spiraling galaxies. I descended into the Stone Heart slowly, one careful step after another. The closer I got to the center, the more the air seemed to thicken, not with moisture or any physical substance, but with presence. It was as though the space was becoming increasingly aware of me, increasingly willing to acknowledge my existence. At the very center of the Stone Heart, there was a flat stone that rose slightly above the surrounding surface. And on that stone, arranged in a deliberate pattern, were objects. There was a bone, too long to belong to any animal native to the region. There were shells from oceanic species that would have required significant trade connections to obtain. There were stones carved into patterns that matched the marks on the floor. And there were personal items, a watch, a pair of eyeglasses, a hair ribbon, a leather wallet. Items from the modern world that should have had no place in this ancient space. One of the items was a field notebook. I opened it carefully and read the handwriting inside. It was Violet Perry's research journal. The last entry was dated 3 days after she had disappeared. It read, "I have passed through. The mountains have a voice that predates language. I can hear it now. I can understand it. The trees are singing in frequencies that human ears cannot ordinarily perceive. But here, in this place beyond the boundary, I can hear every note. I am home. I am finally home. I do not wish to return." The entry below that was in a different handwriting, characters that were not English letters, that seemed to be written in a script that did not correspond to any human language. It was the handwriting of the shadow people, I realized. They had responded to Violet's words in their own way, leaving their own mark in her journal. I knew then that I could not tell Ryan or Isaac what I had found. I could not tell the authorities or anyone else who might attempt a rescue operation. Violet was not a prisoner. She was not held against her will. She had chosen to cross through the doorway because the place she had found was calling to something deep within her consciousness, something that had been longing for such a place all of her life. And I understood that more would follow. The doorways were weakening. The boundary was becoming increasingly permeable. And in the shadow realm, the old ceremonies were calling for more participants, more consciousness, more vital force to help them maintain their existence in a world that had tried so hard to forget them. That night, I made camp near the Stone Heart. I did not sleep. Instead, I sat in absolute silence and listened to the world beyond the boundary begin to sing. Between 2012 and 2014, the disappearances accelerated. It began with hikers who went missing from popular trails, people whose disappearances could be attributed to accidents or misadventure. Then it progressed to local people, residents of the town surrounding the park who ventured into the forest and never returned. By 2014, the Park Service had logged 17 confirmed missing persons cases related to the wilderness area I patrolled. The official narratives varied: hiking accident, bear attack, exposure, drowning in the deep mountain streams, mental health crisis leading to suicide. The authorities put together search teams, they followed protocols, they filed reports, and almost none of them came close to the truth. What was actually happening was that the shadow people were becoming increasingly present in the material world. The doorways were widening. The ceremonies in the realm beyond the boundary were intensifying. And through some mechanism that I did not fully understand, the people who ventured into the deep forest were being called. They were being selected. They were being invited to cross through. The selection process, I came to understand, was not random. The people who were chosen were those who had something to offer. Violet had offered her knowledge of ecological systems. Others offered different things. There was a musician who disappeared near the high waterfalls. He had been a virtuoso on instruments that required precision of hand and understanding of tonal relationships. There was a mathematician conducting a research project on the topology of complex systems who vanished in the eastern sector. There was a group of environmental activists who had been protesting logging operations and who entered the forest to survey potential protected lands. Each person who crossed through the doorways carried with them skills, knowledge, and consciousness that the shadow realm required. It was as though the realm beyond the boundary was building something, assembling a new structure of understanding that bridged the gap between the human world and the world of pure spirit. And I was beginning to understand my own role in this process. Thomas, the elder who had first explained the shadow people to me, passed away in the winter of 2013. I attended his funeral and sat with members of his extended family, though I was never formally introduced or acknowledged. But afterward, one of Thomas's great-grandsons, a man named Samuel who worked as a high school history teacher, approached me privately. Samuel knew what I had been doing. Somehow, through the network of indigenous connections that existed beneath the surface of official society, the knowledge of my patrols and my investigation into the boundary had been communicated to Thomas and then to his family. Samuel handed me a sealed envelope. "My grandfather wanted you to have this," Samuel said. "He told me that you would know when to open it and what to do with the information inside." The envelope contained a handwritten document, written in Thomas's careful script. It was a map, not of geographic locations, but of the 17 thin places that I had identified, along with additional locations that I had not yet discovered. But it was more than a map. The document included translations of ancient texts, descriptions of the ceremonies that had originally maintained the boundary, and most importantly, instructions on how to conduct those ceremonies again. According to the text that Thomas had preserved, the shadow people were not manifestations of a curse or a spiritual infection. They were the living memory of a culture that had been displaced and nearly destroyed. For generations, they had existed in a state of dormancy, sustained by the sacredness of the land itself, but lacking the conscious intention that would allow them to fully manifest. The ceremonies had been the mechanism through which conscious intention had been focused, transformed into power, translated into the structure of reality itself. Without the ceremonies, the shadow people had become increasingly desperate. They were deteriorating, fragmenting, pulling at the boundaries between worlds in uncontrolled ways. The disappearances and the manifestations were not attacks on the human world. They were calls for help. They were requests for someone to restore the ceremonies and the intention that would allow the shadow people to stabilize and sustain themselves. And according to Thomas's text, that someone was supposed to be me. The document contained detailed instructions for a ceremony that would need to be conducted at the Stone Heart. It would need to be performed during the autumn equinox, at the moment when day and night held equal power. It would require the participation of people who had been chosen by the shadow realm itself. People who had seen the shadow people and survived the encounter. People who carried the awareness of the boundary in their consciousness. Several of the young people who had encountered the shadow creatures in the early years, Ryan Sanders, Stella Price, Nathan Bennett, Lucy Wood, Isaac Barnes, Aurora Ross, Caleb Henderson, Ellie Coleman, and Thomas Jenkins, had agreed to participate, though how they had been contacted and what they understood about their role remained unclear to me. The ceremony that Thomas had described was not something I could undertake lightly. According to the text, performing the ceremony would mark the completion of a major transition. The boundary between the human world and the shadow realm would become stable again, but it would remain permeable. Humans and shadow people would need to coexist in a relationship of mutual awareness and respect. The doorways would remain open to those who were called, but there would be no more unexpected disappearances, no more people wandering through by accident. The cost of performing the ceremony, according to Thomas's notes, would be significant. The person conducting the ritual, the person taking on the role of intermediary, would need to anchor themselves partially in both worlds. I would no longer be entirely human. I would never entirely belong to the physical world again. But I would gain the ability to protect the boundary, to guide those who cross through it, and to ensure that the balance between the two realms remained stable. In other words, I would become something like a ranger for the shadow people, a guardian of both worlds. A keeper of the boundary. I spent the entire winter of 2014 preparing for the ceremony. I reached out to the young people who Thomas's document had identified. One by one, they responded, confirming their willingness to participate. Some of them had encountered the shadow people directly. Others had experienced manifestations or missing time or unexplained visions. But all of them seemed to understand, without being told explicitly, that the ceremony was necessary. We began to meet in secret, gathering at the edge of the park in the small town where Thomas had lived. I taught them what I could about the history of the mountain peoples, about the ceremonies that had been conducted here for thousands of years, about the nature of the shadow people and their role in maintaining the spiritual integrity of the land. I prepared them for what it would mean to stand in the Stone Heart and to lend their consciousness to a ritual that would reshape the boundaries of reality. By the spring of 2014, we were ready. The autumn equinox fell on September 21st that year. I had requested a week of vacation time, citing personal matters that required my attention. My supervisor, John Matthews, had seemed relieved to see me taking time off. He was concerned about my mental health. He had noticed the increasing number of incident reports that I was filing, the irregularities in my patrol logs, the way I seemed to be more focused on the deep wilderness than on the recreational areas that most visitors frequented. If he had known the truth, he would have had me removed from duty immediately, probably referred to psychiatric evaluation. But the truth was something that lived beyond the reach of official investigation or standard psychiatric methodology. On the evening of September 20th, I made my final entry in my official Ranger notebook. The text was deliberately vague. End of patrol in northern sector, transferring to extended leave, personal research and reflection required, will return to duty status pending administrative review. Then I met the others at the entrance to the Stone Heart. They arrived one by one, over the course of the evening. Ryan Sanders came first, followed by Stella Price, then Nathan Bennett and Lucy Wood, Isaac Barnes and Aurora Ross, Caleb Henderson and Ellie Coleman. Thomas Jenkins arrived last, moving slowly through the darkness with a kind of acceptance that suggested he had already made his peace with what was about to occur. There were 9 of them, plus myself, making 10 participants in the ceremony. According to Thomas's notes, 10 had been the traditional number for the most powerful rituals, 1 person for each of the 10 directions that the mountain peoples had recognized: north, south, east, west, up, down, inward, outward, present, and future. I distributed the items that Thomas had provided, objects that had been blessed in the old ways, items that carried resonance with the ceremonies of centuries past. A feather, a stone, a shell, a piece of bone, a small wooden carving, a length of sinew, a handful of sacred earth, a bowl of water, a container of herbs, a piece of wood from a tree that had been struck by lightning. As darkness deepened and the stars emerged, I led the group down into the Stone Heart. The transformation of the space was immediate. The bowl that had appeared still and contained when I was alone had become alive with energy. The air itself was vibrating with a frequency that was almost audible but not quite. The markings on the stone floor were glowing faintly with a luminescence that had no source I could identify, and the shadow people were waiting. They had arranged themselves in a circle around the perimeter of the stone heart. Not the handful that I had encountered in previous years, but dozens of them, hundreds. The space seemed to contain more shadow figures than its physical dimensions should have allowed, but they arranged themselves in layers, occupying multiple planes of existence simultaneously. Each of the young people in our group had different reactions upon seeing the assembled shadow people. Ryan gasped and took a step backward before steadying himself. Stella began to weep quietly. Nathan fell to his knees. Lucy reached out her hand as though trying to touch something just beyond her perception. Isaac stood absolutely still, his breathing shallow. Aurora began to laugh, not from hysteria, but from a kind of recognition that suggested she had seen this before, in dreams or in some other state of consciousness that she could not ordinarily access. Caleb and Ellie held hands. Thomas Jenkins closed his eyes and began to hum, a low sound that seemed to resonate with the frequency vibrating through the air itself. I stepped to the center of the stone heart and raised my hands. The shadow people responded by drawing closer, their forms beginning to overlap, beginning to merge into a collective presence that was larger and more unified than any individual manifestation. And I began to chant the words that Thomas had written in his notebook. The words were in a language that was not English. I could not say with certainty which language it was or how I understood their meaning, but the sound that emerged from my throat was not my own voice. It was the voice of the mountain, the voice of the stone and the trees, the voice of every person who had ever walked these ridges with intention and respect. The young people began to move, guided by instinct rather than instruction, arranging themselves in a pattern that matched the geometry marked on the stone floor. Each of them held out the sacred object that I had given them, and as I continued to chant, the objects began to glow, faintly at first, then with increasing intensity. The shadow people responded by beginning to sing. Their song was not words and not melody in any conventional sense, but it was unmistakably song. It was the sound of wind across stone. It was the sound of water flowing through underground channels. It was the sound of roots drawing nourishment from deep earth. It was the sound of mycelial networks connecting trees beneath the forest floor. It was the sound of millions of years compressed into a single moment of utterance. I felt something fundamental shifting in my consciousness. The boundary between myself and the landscape was dissolving. I was no longer a person standing in a stone bowl in the Appalachian Mountains. I was the mountains themselves. I was the memory of the people who had inhabited this land for thousands of years. I was the voice of the shadow people, their existence, their yearning, their determination to remain present in a world that had tried to forget them. The young people in the circle were undergoing a similar transformation. Each of them was becoming more than human, more than individual. They were becoming conduits, vessels through which the consciousness of the two worlds could merge and communicate. And then, in a moment that felt simultaneous with and separate from time itself, the ceremony reached its completion. The shadow people's song resolved into perfect silence. The glow from the sacred objects intensified to almost blinding brightness, and the boundary between the human world and the shadow realm, which had been deteriorating and fragmenting for nearly 400 years, became stable once more. But it remained permeable. The doorways remained open. The shadow people remained present, visible to those who were chosen to see them, accessible to those who were called. When the light faded and my vision returned to normal, I found myself standing in the stone heart with 8 young people gathered around me. Thomas Jenkins was gone. I did not see him leave the circle, did not see him walk back up the path to the surface, but his absence was unmistakable. I would later understand that Thomas had become the bridge. In order to stabilize the ceremony, a consciousness needed to remain partially anchored in the shadow realm, present in that place between worlds, maintaining the connection, ensuring that the balance never again deteriorated. Thomas had accepted that role, and he had transitioned into a state of being that was neither fully human nor fully shadow, but something that existed in the space between. When we emerged from the stone heart an hour later, the park was exactly as it had been when we entered it. The stars were the same. The darkness was the same, but everything had changed. That was 7 years ago. I have not been officially listed as a ranger since 2014. The Park Service conducted an investigation and determined that I had abandoned my post and was unfit for duty. They attempted to contact me for psychiatric evaluation, but I had already transitioned into a role that made ordinary human interaction increasingly difficult. I am still in the mountains. I patrol the trails and monitor the boundaries, but I do so in a capacity that no official government organization would ever acknowledge or recognize. I can see the shadow people now at will, and I can communicate with them. I can sense when someone is in danger of wandering through one of the thin places, and I can guide them back to safety if they are not meant to pass through. The disappearances have stopped. There have been no inexplicable vanishings since the ceremony in 2014. The young people who participated in the ritual have returned to ordinary lives, though each of them carries the weight of what they witnessed and participated in. Ryan Sanders became a wilderness guide. Stella Price is now a conservationist. Nathan Bennett, Lucy Wood, Isaac Barnes, Aurora Ross, Caleb Henderson, and Ellie Coleman have all found work that keeps them connected to the natural world in significant ways. I am no longer entirely human. When I stand in front of mirrors, my reflection flickers slightly, as though I am not entirely solid in this dimension. When I speak to people, they often seem not to hear my words, as though my voice does not carry properly through the air. When I eat, I taste ash and shadow alongside the food, but I am at peace. I have been given a purpose. I have become the guardian that the mountain required, the one who walks between the human world and the realm of spirits, ensuring that the boundary remains stable, ensuring that the mountain's voice can continue to speak to those who still know how to listen. If you are experiencing unusual phenomena in the Appalachian wilderness, if you have seen figures made of shadow, if you have encountered missing time, if you have felt the mountain calling to something deep within your consciousness, know that you are not hallucinating. You are not losing your mind. You are being invited to remember something that your culture tried very hard to make you forget. The mountains are alive. The spirits of the first peoples are still here, and the boundary between the human world and the world of spirit remains permeable for those who are worthy of crossing. Thank you for listening to this testimony. Please like this video. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more about the thin places, the doorways, and the shadow people of the mountains. In our next episode, I will tell you what happens when someone deliberately attempts to cross through one of the thin places, what the transition is like, what lies beyond the boundary, and what price must be paid by those who choose to leave the human world behind forever. Until then, be careful in the deep forest, and if you see shadows moving where light should prevent them, do not run, do not speak. Simply step aside, bow your head in respect, and allow them to pass. They are home here, and they are watching. Before we begin, I need to tell you something that most people will not believe. What I am about to share with you happened in the mountains where my family worked for generations, in places where the old ways never truly died. I have spent 15 years protecting these lands, and in that time I have learned that some guardians do not rest peacefully. Some guardians become something else entirely. What you will hear today is a warning from someone who survived an encounter with something that should have remained a legend. When you finish listening to this account, do not dismiss it as folklore or mountain superstition. Instead, think of it as a survival guide for those foolish enough to venture into the older graveyards of Appalachia after sunset. These cemeteries hold secrets that predate the nation itself, and they have protectors that will not hesitate to enforce the boundaries of their domain. As you listen, I encourage you to like this video before we go any further. Not because I need recognition for telling this story, but because the more people who hear this account, the safer you all might be. My name is irrelevant to what happened during the autumn of that year. What matters is that I was a park ranger stationed in a region of the Appalachian Mountains that tourists rarely visited. The region lay between 3 counties in a state I will not name, in a valley carved out by ancient rivers and ancient peoples. The valley contained something unusual. Within a 6-mile stretch, there existed 7 cemeteries. Not small family plots, but full burial grounds, some dating back centuries. The oldest predated the formation of the county itself. Historians debated endlessly about the origins. Some insisted they were colonial graves. Others pointed to evidence suggesting indigenous burial grounds that had been repurposed by settlers. My supervisor, a man named Director Hartwell, assigned me to these cemeteries because I requested the post. I wanted isolation. I wanted to work in a place where few people ventured. I wanted to understand the history of the land I walked on every day. The assignment seemed simple enough. Maintain the trails, monitor for illegal activity, ensure no grave sites were disturbed or desecrated. Respond to emergency calls within the cemetery boundaries. Keep records of any unusual occurrences. I took the job seriously. Every morning before sunrise, I would hike between the cemeteries, walking the perimeter trails, checking for signs of disturbance. Every evening before sunset, I would make my final rounds. I filled notebooks with observations. I photographed headstones. I documented the history carved into stone. In my second week, I noticed something peculiar. In the largest cemetery, the oldest one they called Mercy Hill, there was a section cordoned off with rope and weathered signs. The signs read, "Restricted area, no entry, hazardous ground." The cemetery curator, an elderly woman named Margaret, visited me at my station one afternoon. She brought coffee and a grave expression. Margaret told me that no one entered that section, not because of official policy, but because people who did enter that section often left the cemetery before completing their visit. Some reported feeling watched. Others claimed they heard footsteps following them. One visitor 30 years ago had run out screaming about something she had seen among the headstones. I asked Margaret what was in that section. She took a long time answering. She said the section contained graves of people who had disappeared in the mountains decades ago. Their bodies had never been found, yet somehow graves had been established for them anyway. And in all the years the cemetery had existed, no one had ever wanted to be buried in that section, and no one had ever wanted to maintain it. I told Margaret the first would look into it. She did not look relieved by this statement. During the third week of my assignment, the group arrived. They came in a van with an Educational Foundation logo on the side. There were 10 of them, all between the ages of 15 and 24. They were part of what they called a heritage program. They had been selected to spend a week in the Appalachian region learning about indigenous history and pre-colonial burial practices. Their instructor was a woman named Professor Hart. She had credentials in anthropology and an enthusiasm that seemed almost obsessive about the old graveyards. Professor Hart approached me directly one morning when my group was gathering at the main cemetery entrance. She explained that her students needed access to several of the restricted areas for their educational project. Specifically, she wanted permission to study the oldest burial grounds. I told her I would need to check with the administration. She seemed annoyed but agreed to wait. The names of the students were James Carter, who was 15, Emma Wilson, 16 years old, Liam Harris, 17, Olivia Clark, 18, Noah Lewis, 19, Ava Walker, 20, William Hall, 21, Sophia Allen, 22, Benjamin Young, 23 years old, and Isabella King, the oldest, at 24. They seemed like ordinary young people. Some were excited about the project. Others looked bored. A few appeared genuinely interested in the historical and cultural significance of the sites. I approved their request, but with conditions. They could visit the graveyards only during daylight hours. They could not venture past the boundaries marked by the signs. They had to remain in groups of at least 3 at all times, and they were required to report their location and activities to me at the start of each day and at the end of each session. Professor Hart agreed to all the conditions. She seemed confident that nothing unusual would occur. I envied her confidence. The students began their work the next morning. They were there when I made my first rounds. James Carter was photographing headstones. Emma Wilson was taking measurements. Liam Harris and Olivia Clark were examining the soil composition with tools they had brought. I watched them work for a while, then continued my patrol. But something felt different in the cemetery that day. The air seemed heavier. The birds seemed quieter. Even the wind through the trees had a different quality to it, as if the land itself was becoming aware of their presence. By that evening, when I made my final rounds, something had changed more profoundly. As I walked among the graves, I began to feel as though I was being observed, not by the students who had long since departed, but by something else, something that had taken notice of the disturbance in its domain. I quickened my pace. I do not know why. Instinct, perhaps, or memory of old warnings my grandfather had shared about places like this. When I reached my station, I locked the door, something I had never done before. I sat in the darkness and listened to the sounds of the valley at night, and I heard footsteps on the gravel path outside. They were not the footsteps of a human. The rhythm was wrong. The weight distribution was wrong. Something moved with a gait that suggested a creature walking on terrain it did not fully understand. I turned off my lights. I waited. The footsteps circled the building 3 times. Then they faded into the distance. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I examined the gravel path outside my station. I found marks that I could not identify with certainty, but they looked like something had walked in circles around my door. The patterns were strange. One section of gravel seemed disturbed in a way that suggested something very heavy had stood in one spot for an extended period. I said nothing to Professor Hart or her students when they arrived. What could I say? That I felt watched? That something had circled my station? They would have dismissed me as superstitious or paranoid, but I began to investigate the restricted section of Mercy Hill Cemetery. During daylight hours, when visibility was best, I examined the graves in that cordoned-off area. The headstones were old. Some dated back to the 1880s. Most bore the names of people who had been reported as missing in the surrounding regions. Missing hikers, missing hunters, missing children, missing travelers. Over 100 graves, all for people who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. On several of the headstones, I found something unusual. Carvings had been added after the stones were originally placed. The carvings looked ancient, but they had been made within the last century. They depicted symbols I did not recognize, symbols that resembled neither European nor indigenous artistic traditions. That night, I pulled historical records from the county archives. I spent hours cross-referencing the names on the headstones with records of missing persons reports. What I discovered disturbed me profoundly. The missing people had not all gone missing due to accidents or natural causes. Many had gone missing during ceremonies or gatherings in the mountains. Others had disappeared near this very cemetery, at times that corresponded with specific dates marked on the headstones. The dates were irregular, but they were never random. They occurred in cycles. Sometimes one disappearance every 10 years. Sometimes 3 in a single year, but they always occurred, and they had been occurring for nearly 2 centuries. By the 4th day of the student group's visit, I became convinced that something very old and very dangerous inhabited these mountains. Something that had been here long before the cemeteries were established. Something that these graves had been created to acknowledge, if not to appease. That evening, I finally did something I should have done earlier. I called Director Hartwell. He listened to my report with increasing skepticism. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he told me that the valley had been designated a protected research area for that very reason. The previous park ranger, a man named Samuel Coker, had died in the cemeteries 15 years ago. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, but Director Hartwell said that Coker had been found near the restricted section, positioned in a way that suggested he had been running when he died. I asked Director Hartwell if there had been other incidents. He told me that the previous 5 rangers assigned to that post, dating back 30 years, had all either quit or died under questionable circumstances. He said my job was to maintain order and file reports, not to investigate folklore or legend. And he strongly advised me to keep the students away from the restricted sections and to encourage the group to leave when their week was completed. I asked why they did not simply close the cemetery to the public. He said that the cemetery had historical significance and that the restricted areas were carefully managed to prevent public access. As long as no official records reported supernatural occurrences, the cemetery remained open. In other words, if I did not file reports of anything unusual, nothing unusual had happened. And my predecessor's death remained officially a medical emergency, not a mystery. I understood the implications. I was on my own. That night, I reviewed my assignment terms one more time. I was required to maintain safety in the cemetery areas. I was required to monitor for illegal activity and environmental damage. But I was not required to investigate phenomena for which there were no official explanations. So I made a decision. I would observe the phenomena without reporting it. I would gather data without filing official accounts. And I would keep the students safe by any means necessary. The next morning, the 5th day of their stay, something changed. Emma Wilson reported the first concrete incident. She came to my station early in the morning, before the other students had arrived. She was visibly shaken, though she tried to hide it. She told me that she and Liam Harris had been working near the boundary of the restricted section the previous evening, just before sunset. They were measuring distances between graves and documenting headstone inscriptions. They had been focused on their work when Liam suddenly told her to move away from the fence line. She asked him why. He said because something was standing on the other side of the rope, just beyond her line of sight. When she turned to look, she saw nothing at first, but then she noticed that the grass was disturbed in a pattern that suggested something very large had been standing in that exact spot. The grass was pressed down as if an enormous weight had been resting there. What alarmed Emma the most was that the disturbance was too large to be human. The width and depth of the depression suggested something roughly 8 feet tall and extremely heavy. I asked her if she saw any footprints. She said that there were no clear tracks, but the ground seemed scorched in places. Not burned, but discolored. as if something acidic or extremely hot had been standing there. I told Emma not to work near that boundary again. She seemed relieved by this instruction. Later that morning, I examined the spot she had described. I found exactly what she reported. The grass was pressed down in a clear impression. The ground was discolored, and there was a smell, faint but present, like something had burned or decayed in that location. Most disturbing was a sound I heard at that spot. Even in daylight, when I stood in the impression, I heard a low hum. It was not loud, but it was constant. It seemed to emanate from the ground itself, or possibly from something beneath the ground. I made notes in my journal. I took photographs, but I did not file an official report. By afternoon, 2 more incidents had occurred. William Hall came to find me while I was cataloging equipment. He said that his group had been working in a different cemetery, the one called Old Ridge. While they were examining graves, they had noticed that all the birds had vanished, not just become silent, but completely absent. And then, all at once, the birds had returned, arriving from no visible direction, as if they had been released from confinement. The same students reported that they heard a sound like the snapping of tree branches, but the sound came from directly above them, despite there being no forest canopy in the open cemetery area. That evening, Isabella King asked to speak with me privately. I brought her to the main office at my station. She told me that Professor Hart was planning something, though she did not know what. She said that Hart had been communicating with someone outside the official educational program. Isabella had seen Hart receiving calls and text messages from an unknown contact, and Hart had been spending her evenings poring over old documents and maps, muttering about dates and alignments. Isabella said she was worried about the group. She said that Hart seemed obsessed with the cemetery project in a way that went beyond academic interest, and she said that something in the cemetery felt wrong. Not wrong in a natural sense, but wrong in a way that suggested intentional design, as if the cemetery was arranged according to some purpose that the students did not understand. I asked Isabella what she thought Hart was planning. She said she did not know, but she recommended that I keep a close watch on Hart's activities. I thanked Isabella for the information. I told her to stay alert and to immediately report any unusual occurrences. She seemed grateful for being taken seriously. That night, I examined the maps and documents in my station that pertained to the cemetery grounds. I looked for patterns, and I found them. The cemeteries were not placed randomly in the valley. They were positioned in a geometric pattern. When I plotted their locations on a map, they formed a perfect circle. The oldest cemetery, Mercy Hill, was at the center. Within that circle, at specific points marked by the oldest graves, there were carvings. The carvings were ancient, but they had been renewed repeatedly over centuries. They matched the symbols I had seen on the headstones in the restricted section. I understood then that this was not a cemetery, or rather, it was a cemetery in form only. The true purpose of these burial grounds was containment. They were built to keep something confined to this valley, and the graves themselves, including those in the restricted section, marked the boundaries of that containment. The missing people whose names were carved on those headstones had not been buried there as an honor or memorial. They had been the price of the containment. They had been sacrifices to maintain whatever barrier kept the entity bounded to this land. I spent the entire night researching this theory. I cross-referenced historical records. I examined old maps. I interviewed Margaret, the cemetery curator, in person. Margaret was reluctant to discuss the matter directly, but when I mentioned the symbols and the geometric placement of the cemeteries, she became visibly frightened. She told me that she had suspected the truth for decades. She said that her predecessor, and his predecessor before him, had all known the purpose of the cemeteries. Margaret said that the graves in the restricted section had stopped being filled approximately 40 years ago. Before that, there had been regular additions to that cemetery, but something had changed. The disappearances had ceased. The need for the sacrifice had ended or been suspended. She said that was when people began to feel the presence more acutely. Before, when the sacrifices were regular, the entity seemed satisfied. It stayed within its boundaries. But once the sacrifices stopped, the entity began to probe its borders. It began to reach beyond the cemeteries. It began to hunt. Margaret said that she kept the restricted section cordoned off not to protect the graves, but to prevent people from learning the truth. If no one ventured into that section, no one would discover the historical records carved there. No one would understand what the graves truly meant. But now students were here. Students who were actively investigating. And Professor Hart seemed to understand more than she had any right to know. I asked Margaret what she thought Hart was planning. She said that Hart was likely attempting to document the entity. to prove its existence using historical research and archaeological evidence. And if she succeeded, if she gathered enough proof, then the secrets that had been kept for nearly 2 centuries would be exposed to the world. I asked Margaret what would happen then. She said that when the boundaries of containment were threatened with public exposure, the entity would cease to acknowledge the boundary at all. It would hunt freely, and it would not stop. Margaret warned me that I needed to stop the students from continuing their work by any means necessary. That conversation took place on the evening of the 5th day of the students' residency. On the morning of the 6th day, everything began to go very wrong. James Carter did not appear for breakfast. The other students noticed immediately. He was only 15, and he was part of their group. They approached Professor Hart and asked about his whereabouts. Hart seemed unconcerned. She said that James had mentioned wanting to wake early to photograph the sunrise from the cemetery grounds. She was certain he would return within the hour, but he did not return within the hour, or within 2 hours. By the time the students informed me, James had been missing for 4 hours. I immediately organized a search team from the other students. I divided them into groups and assigned each group to a specific cemetery. I gave strict instructions to stay in contact via radio and to report any unusual findings immediately. At first, we found nothing. James was not in any of the cemeteries. We expanded the search to the surrounding trails and forest areas. Then, at approximately noon, I received a radio call from Noah Lewis. He said they had found something in Mercy Hill Cemetery, in the restricted section. He said there was something drawn on the ground in the graveyard and they needed me to come immediately. I went to the cemetery. When I arrived, I found the students clustered at the rope boundary of the restricted section, staring at something inside. What I saw defied immediate explanation. In the center of the restricted section, a perfect circle had been drawn or burned into the earth. The circle was approximately 10 feet in diameter. At its center lay James Carter. He was alive. He was conscious, but he was not moving. His eyes were open and they were tracking me as I approached. His mouth moved as if he was trying to speak, but no sound emerged. The circle around him was perfectly symmetrical. It appeared to have been created by heat, not by any tool. The grass was burned away. The soil was blackened. And at regular intervals around the circle, marks had been burned into the ground, marks that matched the symbols I had seen on the headstones. I knew immediately that I could not allow James to remain inside that circle. Something had placed him there deliberately. Something had marked him with its presence and its symbols. I crossed the rope boundary and approached the circle. The moment my foot touched the burned grass, I heard it, a sound that I have never been able to adequately describe. It was like the sound of something moving underground, like the scraping of something enormous against stone. It was like the call of an animal that has no natural counterpart in the modern world. And it was like a voice speaking a language that predated human speech. I did not hesitate. I stepped into the circle and grabbed James. I lifted him and ran back across the boundary. When I crossed the rope line, the sound stopped. James gasped and began breathing heavily. His body was ice cold, though the day was warm. The other students were shocked. I told them to go back to the main area, to gather their belongings, and to prepare to evacuate the cemetery grounds immediately. Most of the students obeyed without question. But Professor Hart blocked my path. She said, "Do not remove him from the circle. You are disrupting the pattern." I asked her what pattern. She told me that she had spent 3 years researching this cemetery complex. She had studied the missing persons records, she had traced the disappearances back for centuries, and she had come to understand that this was not a burial ground at all. This was a gate, a threshold between worlds. The disappearances, she said, had not been accidents. They had been initiation ceremonies. Young people like James Carter were being called here. They were being marked and claimed by something ancient, and if the pattern was allowed to complete, that something would be able to cross the boundary between its realm and ours. Hart said that James was the key, the first one who had been willing to enter the circle willingly, the first one who had been marked with the symbols. If she could document the process, if she could photograph the entity as it crossed through the gate, she would have proof of the existence of something beyond human understanding. She said this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Academic immortality. The chance to prove that reality was far stranger than anyone had ever imagined. I told Hart that I was not interested in her ambitions. I was removing James from the cemetery, and I was disbanding her research project immediately. She tried to physically prevent me from leaving, but I moved past her without difficulty. I carried James to the main entrance of the cemetery, where the other students were waiting. I told them all to go to the main visitor center and wait there. I said I needed to speak with Professor Hart alone, but Hart did not follow me. Instead, she ran directly to the restricted section and stood in the center of the burned circle. I realized what she was doing. She was offering herself as a replacement. She was attempting to complete whatever ritual or process the entity had begun with James Carter. I told the students to lock the visitor center doors. I told them not to leave, regardless of what they heard or what they saw. And then I went back to Mercy Hill. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to set. The light was failing fast, and Hart was still standing in the circle, completely motionless. I called out to her. She did not respond. I called out again, louder. Still no response. I was preparing to enter the circle again when I heard the sound. That same impossible sound. But this time it was louder. This time it seemed to be coming from directly below the earth. The ground began to vibrate. Not a violent shaking, but a deep resonance that I felt in my bones. And in that vibration I felt the presence of something vast. Something that existed partially in this world and partially in another. I saw something then. I do not have a good explanation for what I saw, and I am still not entirely certain it was real. But in the moment, standing at the edge of that burned circle, I witnessed a shape beginning to form in the air above the center of the circle. It was enormous. It seemed to be made of darkness itself, with edges that did not remain stable or consistent. It had a suggestion of form, but that form kept shifting and changing, and where it began to emerge into the physical world, reality itself seemed to strain and distort. Hart was still standing in the circle, and she was raising her hands toward the emerging shape. She was welcoming it. I could not allow whatever was happening to continue. I found a tree branch among the graveyard debris. It was long and sturdy. I took aim and threw it directly into the center of the circle, striking Hart and disrupting her position. Hart fell. She cried out in pain, and the sound from beneath the earth changed pitch. The vibration ceased. The shape that had been forming began to dissipate and collapse back into the ground. I ran into the circle and grabbed Hart. She was struggling and screaming, but I pulled her out of the circle and across the rope boundary. The moment she crossed the boundary, everything went silent. The sound ceased. The vibration stopped. The shape vanished completely. Hart collapsed on the grass, weeping and screaming incoherently about what she had almost achieved, about the knowledge that was almost within her grasp. I carried her to my station. I did not bring her to the visitor center where the other students were waiting. Instead, I secured her in a locked room and called Director Hartwell. I told him everything that had happened. I told him about the circle. I told him about the entity attempting to cross the boundary. I told him about Professor Hart's deliberate attempt to facilitate that crossing. Director Hartwell was silent for a long time. Then he told me to do 3 things immediately. First, I was to evacuate all the students from the cemetery grounds. I was to escort them personally to the nearest town and ensure they did not return. Second, I was to detain Professor Hart until official personnel arrived to collect her. He said that Hart would be debriefed and relocated. I was instructed not to allow her to communicate with anyone, including the students. Third, I was to seal all the cemetery grounds immediately. I was to close all access points, cancel all permits for research or visitation, and post warning signs. I was to present an official report stating that the cemeteries were being closed due to structural hazards and contamination issues. Director Hartwell also told me something else. He said that what I had witnessed in that circle was exactly what his predecessors had been trying to prevent for generations. He said that the cemetery complex was indeed constructed as a containment structure, and he said that Professor Hart was not the first outsider who had attempted to breach that containment. In 1987, a paranormal researcher had attempted to cross the boundary. He had been found 3 days later, dead, with no apparent cause of death. His body had been so severely decomposed that it was barely recognizable. In 1963, 2 university researchers had tried to excavate the graves in the restricted section. Both had vanished without a trace. In 1941, a local historian had attempted to document the graves. She had been found in her home weeks later, catatonic and unable to speak. She had remained in that state until her death 20 years later. These were not accidents. These were responses from the entity to defend its boundaries and maintain its isolation from human understanding. I understood then what I had truly signed up for when I accepted this job. I was not a park ranger. I was a warden, and my responsibility was to prevent anyone from learning the truth about what was imprisoned in this valley. By nightfall, I had escorted all the students to the town of Millbrook, approximately 30 miles away. I had provided them with a cover story about a gas leak near the cemetery and advised them to leave the region. Most of them were happy to go. But Emma Wilson lingered. She asked me if there was something more to this than I was telling them. She asked if there was something dangerous in the cemetery. I told her the truth. I said that the cemetery was dangerous, and she was right to be frightened. I said that James Carter had been lucky and that he should never return to the valley. I said that all of them should stay away from this region forever. She seemed to understand. She did not press me for more details. I returned to the valley alone. The work of sealing the cemeteries took 3 days and 3 nights. Director Hartwell sent a team of people to assist me. They were not normal maintenance personnel. They wore uniforms with insignia I did not recognize. They carried equipment I could not identify. And they moved with the efficiency of people who had performed this task multiple times before. They worked in silence, following a specific protocol. At each cemetery, they installed metal gates and posted official closure signs. They placed warning signs and fencing around the perimeter. They sealed access roads and blocked all hiking trails that led to the grave sites. Most importantly, they performed a ritual of their own. I do not know exactly what it involved, but it seemed to require them to walk the boundaries of each cemetery while carrying objects that emitted a low-frequency sound. The frequency made my teeth ache and my head throb. This ritual was performed at dawn, at noon, and at sunset on each day. The team leader, a stern woman named Agent Cross, told me that the sounds were a reinforcement of the barrier. She said that the sounds disrupted the entity's ability to press against the containment boundary. When I asked her how long the reinforcement would last, she said that it would hold for approximately 7 to 10 years depending on how aggressively the entity tested the boundary. After that, the reinforcement would need to be repeated. She also told me that the closure would be listed officially as a safety issue, not a supernatural concern. All records related to the project would be classified. And I was instructed to never speak of what I had witnessed to anyone outside the official structure. If I did speak, she said, official personnel would be required to relocate me permanently to another region. My career would effectively be ended, and anyone I had spoken to would be interviewed and potentially relocated as well. I understood the message. I was part of a larger organization now, one that had been quietly maintaining this secret for generations. And the price of knowing the truth was eternal silence. On the evening of the 3rd day, the team completed their work. Agent Cross presented me with updated official orders. I was to remain as the park ranger for this valley, now officially designated as a protected natural preserve with no public access. My job was to monitor the boundaries and report any anomalies. If the barrier showed signs of weakening, I was to file a report immediately and request emergency reinforcement. If any unauthorized personnel attempted to enter the cemetery grounds, I was to detain them and contact Agent Cross. And if the entity ever breached the boundary entirely, I was to evacuate the surrounding area immediately and implement Emergency Protocol 7. Which involved sealing the valley itself and preventing anyone from entering or leaving until official containment teams arrived. Before Agent Cross left, I asked her about the entity. I asked her what it was, where it came from, why it was imprisoned in this valley. She told me that the entity predated human civilization in this region. It was a creature of the old world, belonging to an era that had existed long before the indigenous peoples had inhabited these mountains. It was a guardian of sorts, of a boundary between the physical world and another realm. The indigenous peoples who had lived in this valley thousands of years ago had understood its nature and had created a system of containment to prevent it from crossing into human territory. The symbols carved on the graves were part of that ancient containment. They were a language of binding and barrier. When European settlers arrived and established their own graveyards, they had unknowingly reinforced the existing containment system. The graves became part of the barrier, but the barrier required maintenance. It required regular reinforcement, and sometimes it required sacrifice. The missing people throughout history had not been random victims. They had been individuals who possessed certain qualities that made them suitable for use in reinforcing the barrier. They were interred in the restricted section, where their physical forms and spiritual essences could be incorporated into the containment framework itself. This had continued until modern times, when the need for additional sacrifices had ceased. The barrier had grown strong enough that new sacrifices were no longer necessary, but the old sacrifice graves remained, and they continued to serve the containment purpose. I asked Agent Cross if the entity could ever escape. She said it could, if someone deliberately destroyed the barrier or if the barrier weakened to the point of failure. She said that was why her organization existed. Her organization had been protecting these sites for over a century, ensuring that the barriers remained intact. Before the modern era, the protection had been maintained by indigenous peoples and later by local groups who understood the danger. When that knowledge was lost to history, the official organizations had taken over the responsibility. She said that there were dozens of such sites across the North American continent. Each one contained something that needed to remain imprisoned, and each one was maintained by her organization in absolute secrecy. I asked her name. She told me that she preferred not to share personal information. She said that in this line of work, personal identities were less important than the mission itself. After Agent Cross departed, I was alone in the valley again. The cemeteries were now completely sealed. The gates were locked. The warnings were posted. The boundaries were reinforced. And I was the sole guardian of this secret. I spent the following weeks establishing new routines. I monitored the gates and boundaries daily. I maintained my equipment and supplies. I filed regular reports with Director Hartwell, and every night I listened to the sounds from the valley. The sounds had changed. They were quieter now, less aggressive, but they had not ceased entirely. The entity was still aware of my presence. It was still testing the boundaries, but more gently now, as if it was content to remain contained for the moment. I began to understand the true nature of my position. I was not just a guardian of the graves, I was also a liaison between two worlds. I existed in the space between the human realm and the realm of the imprisoned entity. And as long as I maintained my post, as long as I reinforced the boundaries and prevented others from learning the truth, both worlds remained in balance. It was a responsibility that would define the rest of my life. But something else occurred to me during those weeks of contemplation, something that troubled me deeply. If the entity was as old as Agent Cross had suggested, if it had existed in this valley for thousands of years, then it might have developed a form of consciousness. It might have awareness. It might even have intentions and desires. And if it had all of those things, then imprisoning it, no matter how necessary for human safety, was still a form of imprisonment. The entity had not asked to be bound to this place. It had not consented to its captivity. It was simply an aspect of a world that had existed long before human civilization. I began to wonder if there was a possibility for coexistence, if the boundaries could be maintained while still allowing the entity some form of communication or limited interaction with the human world. These thoughts troubled me. I did not share them with Director Hartwell or anyone else in the organization. And then, on the evening of the 34th day after the students had left, something unexpected occurred. I was performing my evening patrol around Mercy Hill Cemetery when I noticed something unusual. One of the gates, which I had checked only hours earlier and found firmly locked, was now slightly ajar. I did not panic. I approached carefully and examined the gate thoroughly. There were no signs of forced entry. The lock appeared to be intact. The hinges showed no damage, yet the gate was unquestionably open. I closed the gate and inspected it from the other side. I found something that explained how it had opened without being forced. Carved into the stone pillar beside the gate were new symbols. They were similar to the symbols on the graves, but not identical. These symbols appeared to have been created very recently. The stone was still slightly warm to the touch, and the carving showed no weathering or erosion. The symbols glowed faintly in the darkness, a soft luminescence that seemed to emanate from within the stone itself. I realized immediately that the entity had not attempted to escape. Instead, it had carved a message. It was attempting to communicate. I took photographs of the symbols. Then I contacted Director Hartwell. He told me to document everything and send him the photographs immediately. He also told me to remain outside the gates until official personnel arrived to assess the situation. I documented the symbols carefully, taking multiple photographs from different angles and in different lighting conditions. I also attempted to sketch the symbols in my notebook, though my artistic ability did not do them justice. As I was completing this task, I heard something from beyond the gates. It was that familiar sound, the sound of something vast moving beneath the earth. But this time, the sound seemed almost gentle, almost like a form of vocalization designed to convey meaning rather than threat. The sound continued for approximately 5 minutes, during which I remained motionless outside the gates. Then it ceased. When Director Hartwell called me back, he said that the incident was being classified as a significant escalation. He said that Agent Cross would be arriving within 24 hours to assess the situation and determine if emergency containment measures were needed. But he also told me something that surprised me. He said that the organization had been documenting occasions when the entity appeared to attempt communication. These incidents had been increasing in frequency over the past few decades. He said that some members of the organization believed the entity might be attempting to establish negotiation or dialogue. He said that this was both the most hopeful and most dangerous possibility. If the entity was willing to negotiate, there might be a path toward peaceful coexistence. But negotiation would require that humans agree to terms that might involve limitations on human access to certain regions or acknowledgement of the entity's sovereignty over the valley. Such arrangements would be politically difficult to maintain, and they would require keeping the secret of the entity's existence even more carefully protected. I asked Director Hartwell if he believed communication was possible. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said that he hoped it was possible. He said that the alternative was eternal warfare against an enemy that could not be defeated, only contained. And containment required constant vigilance and sacrifice. A true peace, he said, would be preferable to all involved. Agent Cross arrived the next afternoon. She brought additional personnel and equipment. They examined the gates and the carved symbols extensively. They performed additional reinforcement rituals, placing sensors and monitoring devices around the cemetery perimeter. Agent Cross showed me a device that resembled a combination of seismograph and radio receiver. She explained that this device was designed to detect and record the entity's communications attempts. She said that the organization had been collecting such records for decades and they had been attempting to decode the entity's language. I asked her if they had succeeded in decoding anything. She said that they had identified some basic patterns. The entity seemed to communicate in terms of boundaries, time, and seasonal cycles. It seemed to understand human concepts like territory and agreement, but there had been one communication that had proven particularly difficult to interpret. Approximately 5 years ago, the entity had carved a series of symbols that the organization's specialists believed translated to something like, "Where are the keepers?" Agent Cross said that this question had troubled the organization deeply. The keepers presumably referred to the indigenous peoples who had originally maintained the containment. She said that when European colonization had disrupted the indigenous population, the original keepers had lost their position and access to the burial grounds. The knowledge and responsibility had been transferred to European caretakers and eventually to the modern organization. But the entity had apparently been aware of this transition, and it seemed to be asking why the original keepers had ceased to maintain contact. I asked Agent Cross if the organization had attempted to answer this question. She said that they had not. She said that answering would require acknowledging the entity's sentience and agency, which would fundamentally alter the nature of the containment relationship. But she also said that if communication were ever to occur, the answer to that question would be the first thing that would need to be addressed. Agent Cross remained at the valley for 5 days. During that time, there were no additional attempts by the entity to communicate. The cemetery grounds remained quiet. The boundaries remained firm. Before she left, Agent Cross told me something personal. She told me that she had been born in the same region as this valley. Her family were descendants of the indigenous people who had once maintained the cemeteries. She said that her great-great-grandmother had been one of the last keepers before the organization had taken over the responsibility. Agent Cross said that she had always wondered if the entity remembered the original keepers, if it carried memories of the time when it had been in contact with human minds that understood its language and its nature. She said that if peace was ever achieved in this valley, it would likely come through someone with a connection to both worlds. Someone who understood both the human need for containment and the entity's need for dignity and recognition. Then she departed, leaving me alone again with the sealed cemetery and the vast presence that dwelled beneath it. Weeks passed, months passed, the seasons changed, the barrier held, and I continued my duties as the guardian of the sealed cemetery. But something had shifted in the valley after the entity's attempt at communication. The air felt different. The nightly sounds had changed character. They were no longer aggressive or intrusive. They had become almost rhythmic, almost like a slow, deep breathing, as if the entity was simply resting, waiting, hoping for contact. A year passed since the students had left. The media coverage of the closure had faded. No one challenged my official explanations about the seal. The region remained isolated and undisturbed. In that year, I did something that I had not reported to Director Hartwell or Agent Cross. I conducted my own research into the entity and its nature. I studied historical records of indigenous peoples in the region. I examined archaeological findings. I reviewed accounts of colonial-era disappearances. I compiled everything into a comprehensive archive. What I discovered was a history that predated the recorded history of the region. The indigenous peoples who had inhabited the valley had referred to the entity in their oral traditions using a term that translated roughly to the headless guardian. According to the traditions, the entity was neither good nor evil. It was a force of nature, a being that existed in the space between the physical world and the spirit world. The indigenous peoples had established a covenant with the headless guardian centuries ago. They had built the cemetery graves as a way of creating a space where the two realms could coexist without the entity crossing fully into human territory. The graves were not tombs but anchors. They anchored the entity to the valley and prevented it from wandering. But the graves also served another purpose. They allowed the entity to remain aware of human presence. They allowed it to exist in a state of balance between isolation and connection. When the indigenous peoples were displaced, that balance had been lost. But somehow, through accident or design, the European settlers had perpetuated the grave system. They had unknowingly continued the covenant, even though they no longer understood what they were doing. The entity had adapted to this new situation. It had learned to exist in silence, separated from the human contact it had once known. But that adaptation had cost it something. It had cost it the ability to maintain full awareness and consciousness. The modern organization that now maintained the containment was aware of some of these facts, but they approached the containment purely from a security perspective. They saw the entity as a threat that needed to be neutralized. They did not see it as a being that might be capable of suffering or experiencing the isolation imposed upon it. I wondered if there was a third option. Not the original covenant with the indigenous peoples, not the modern containment by the organization, but something new, something that acknowledged the entity's existence and possible consciousness while still maintaining the safety boundaries that human society required. On the anniversary of the student's departure, I made a decision. I was going to attempt to establish contact with the entity, on my own terms and outside the knowledge of the organization. I spent a week preparing. I studied the symbols I had recorded from the entity's communication attempt. I practiced the phonetic patterns, trying to mimic the sounds that seemed to represent the entity's language. I gathered the tools I would need, and on a night when the sky was clear and the moon was full, I approached the sealed gates of Mercy Hill Cemetery. I did not open the gates. I did not cross the boundary. Instead, I stood at the fence line and I spoke. I spoke in English, knowing that the entity had shown the ability to understand human speech. I told the headless guardian that I was not there as a representative of the organization. I was not there to enforce the containment. I was there as an individual human being, seeking to understand and to communicate. I told the entity about the history I had uncovered, about the original covenant with the indigenous peoples, about the displacement of those peoples and the transfer of responsibility to those who did not understand the true nature of the arrangement. I told the entity that I was sorry for the loss of contact it had experienced. I told it that I could not undo the past or restore what had been lost, but I told it that I could bear witness. I could acknowledge its existence. I could recognize that it was more than simply a threat to be contained. For a long time, nothing happened. I stood at the fence in the darkness, feeling foolish and exposed. Then I heard it. The sound that had become familiar to me over the months. But this time, it was different. It was more refined, more controlled. It carried patterns that suggested intentional communication, and in that sound I heard something like an answer, like an acknowledgement, like, perhaps, a form of gratitude. I did not attempt to decode the sound fully. I simply stood there and listened. I bore witness to it. And I accepted, in that moment, the full weight of my responsibility as the guardian of this place. The sound continued for several minutes, and then it faded. But the entity did not retreat fully into silence. Instead, it seemed to settle into a new kind of quietness. A quietness that felt less like imprisonment and more like peace. I never reported this encounter to Director Hartwell or anyone else in the organization. I have kept the memory of that night to myself, and I have shared it with you in this account. I do not know if I successfully established any real communication with the entity. I do not know if it understood my words or simply responded to my presence, but I know that something changed that night. In the years that have followed, the entity has not attempted to breach the boundary. It has not carved new symbols or reached out for contact. It exists in the valley, contained but not hostile. And I exist outside the boundary, watching and waiting, serving as a bridge between two worlds that can never fully merge but can perhaps learn to coexist. Every year, on the anniversary of that night, I return to the fence. I do not speak, and no sound emerges from beyond the gates. But I stand there in the darkness, acknowledging the presence on the other side, and accepting the burden of knowledge and silence that comes with guarding such a secret. If you have listened to this account, you now know something that very few humans know. You understand that there are things in the old places of this world that are neither entirely good nor entirely evil. They are simply ancient, and they deserve respect, even when they must remain contained for the safety of the living. If you ever find yourself in the Appalachian Mountains, near the old cemeteries, remember this story. Remember that the boundaries that exist there are there for a reason. Remember that some things that rest beneath the ground are resting by choice and by covenant, not by force. And if you ever encounter something in the darkness that seems to be trying to communicate, remember that the most respectful response is not to attempt to destroy it or exploit it, but simply to bear witness to its existence and to treat it with the dignity that any conscious being deserves. This is the account of the headless guardian. This is what I have witnessed and what I have learned in my years as a ranger in this valley. I have shared it with you because the world needs to know that reality is far stranger and far more complex than we have been taught. I do not expect you to believe this account. Belief is not necessary, but understanding is. Understanding that there are mysteries in this world that cannot be solved by science or logic alone. Understanding that some boundaries must be maintained not out of fear but out of respect. I am still the ranger in that valley. I will likely remain here for the rest of my life, and I will continue to fulfill my duties, maintaining the boundaries, bearing witness to the ancient presence, and keeping the secret that has been entrusted to me. This is my story. This is the story of the Headless Guardian and the covenant between worlds. Thank you for listening. Now, let me tell you what happened to the 8 of us during the spring season of 2019. I was the only one who walked out of those Appalachian woods, and I have spent 5 years figuring out why. My name is unimportant. What matters is that I served as ranger for the Northern Appalachian Territories for 8 years before the incident I am about to describe. I had walked those ancient mountains 1,000 times. I knew every creek, every hidden gorge, every trail that wound through the misty valleys. I thought I understood the forest the way a man understands his own home. I was wrong. The season was April. The spring thaw had rendered many of the higher trails impassable, so our team focused on the lower elevations and the hollows where the early season hikers liked to venture. We were told to expect a busy month. The park authority had approved a new trail system that ran deeper into the woodland than any maintained path had ventured before. This was controversial. Some of the older rangers, men who had served in those mountains for 30 and 40 years, had expressed concerns about opening those particular hollows to public access. No one listened to them. The park authority wanted more revenue. More trails meant more visitors, and more visitors meant more funding. So we cleared the path, marked the mile markers, and prepared information stations at each junction. My team consisted of 6 rangers and 2 park conservation specialists. Lucas Wright was my second in command. He was 25, fresh from the Ranger Training Academy, eager to prove himself in the field. He had that particular enthusiasm that comes from not yet understanding the weight of the job. Mia Scott was our lead conservation specialist, 26 years old, focused on botanical surveys. Henry Green, 27, managed our equipment and logistics. Charlotte Baker, 28, was our medic. Alexander Adams, at 29, served as our communications officer. Amelia Nelson, 30, led our maintenance crew. Daniel Hill, 31, supervised our trail work. Harper Mitchell, 32, was our senior ranger and the most skeptical about the new path. And Matthew Roberts, 33, handled our permits and regulatory compliance. We were good people. We were competent people. We were people who understood the mountains in our own way, which means we understood nothing at all. On our first week of April, we conducted the official inspection of the new trail system. It was a clear day, one of those Appalachian spring mornings where the mist is still thick in the hollows but the sun breaks through at the ridge lines. Harper led us through the path for the first time as an official expedition. The trail descended into what the local maps called Grief Hollow, a name I should have questioned more directly. The forest here was different from the higher elevation woods we knew. These trees were older. The rhododendron thickets were denser. The rhododendrons in that hollow were unnaturally white, something I had never seen before in my 8 years of service. As we walked, Lucas turned to me and asked, "Do you hear that?" I listened. There was something in the distance, beyond the sound of our footsteps and the creek water we could hear to our left. It was a sound like humming, not quite a human voice, not quite the wind, something in between. It came from deeper in the forest, from the direction we were heading. "Probably just wind through the gorge," I said, but it was not wind. I knew the sound of wind. I had heard the wind scream through those mountains during storms that nearly took our equipment shelters off their foundations. This was different. This was regular, almost melodic. It had a pattern to it, as though something were singing in a key that human ears were not quite meant to process. Henry asked, "Should we investigate the source?" Harper shook his head. We have a trail to verify. We keep moving. So we kept moving. We followed the trail as it descended deeper into the hollow. The trees grew taller and closer together. The white rhododendrons became more numerous until we seemed to be walking through fields of white flowers on both sides of the path. The humming grew louder. Mia pulled out her botanical survey equipment. "These rhododendrons should not be this white," she said. "I have been working in Appalachian forests for 6 years and I have never documented rhododendrons of this coloration in this region. This is not normal variation. This is albinism or some form of genetic expression that suggests environmental pressure we should be cataloging." As she spoke, the humming intensified. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, as though the forest itself were making the sound. The temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air, and it was only mid-April. That did not make sense. The Weather Service had predicted temperatures in the mid-60s. Charlotte said, "The air temperature just dropped approximately 15 degrees in the last 30 seconds. I have not seen that kind of thermal shift outside of a weather anomaly." We stopped walking. We stood in the middle of the white rhododendron field, listening to the humming that seemed to come from the trees themselves. For the first time since the expedition began, all of us felt the same sensation. We were being observed. We were not alone in the hollow. Alexander said, "We should document our position and begin moving back toward the park entrance." Harper was the senior ranger. The decision was his. He looked around at all of us, assessing the situation with the careful eyes of a man who had served in those mountains for 20 years. Then he made a choice that would define the rest of my life. "We continue," he said. "We finish the verification of the trail. We are rangers. We do not retreat from anomalies. We document them. We report them. We return prepared." It was a reasonable decision. It was the right decision according to protocol. It was also the decision that sent us deeper into the place where the woodland crooner had been waiting for someone to open the path. We continued walking. The humming did not stop. If anything, it seemed to grow more intentional, more purposeful. It was no longer the sound of wind or geological phenomena. It was a sound with intention. It was a sound that wanted to be heard. For the next mile and a half, we descended deeper into Grief Hollow. The white rhododendrons gave way to stands of white pine that seemed impossibly tall for the region. These trees were ancient. The bark on some of them was thick enough that you could hide your hand in the crevices. No trees that old should have been visible from a trail in a maintained park, but these were. The trail had been cut specifically to reveal them. The humming had evolved. It was no longer uniform. There were layers to it now. Harmonies that seemed to come from different directions. It sounded almost like a voice, like someone was trying to speak in a language that human throats could not properly produce. Mia kept stopping to document the flora. She was increasingly agitated. She said, "The trees here are not in my database. Some of these specimens should not exist. The dating on the rings and the bark condition suggests they are over 300 years old. But the park records indicate this entire section was clear-cut in 1847. Daniel said, "Perhaps some seeds were missed. Perhaps a stand regenerated." Mia shook her head. "Trees do not regenerate to this size in 170 years. Not these species, not in this region. Something else is happening here." The path continued to descend. We had covered nearly 3 miles and had descended approximately 800 feet in elevation. We should have reached the bottom of the hollow where a creek junction had been marked. Instead, the path seemed to continue downward, as though the hollow were deeper than the park maps indicated. Lucas walked beside me at this point. He said quietly, "Something is wrong, is it not?" I nodded. "Something is very wrong. But Harper will not turn back until we reach the marked endpoint." "And then what?" Lucas asked. "Then we report what we have found and we let the authority decide if the trail should be closed." Lucas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Do you know the Native American history of this region?" I told him what most rangers know. The Appalachian Mountains had been inhabited by various tribes for thousands of years before European contact. The Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, and other nations had all held territories in different parts of these mountains. But that was centuries ago. That was history, not present reality. Lucas said, "There are stories. Not in the official park records, but there are stories that the old families in the mountain towns tell. Stories about things in the deep hollows that should not be disturbed. Stories about the woodland crooner." I asked him what that was. He said, "From what my grandfather told me, the crooner is an old thing. It is older than European settlement, older than the Cherokee occupation, possibly older than human memory. It is a thing that sings. It lives in the deep hollows and the hidden places in the old forests. The story goes that it calls people to it. It uses a sound, a voice that is not quite human. People hear it and they want to follow. They want to go deeper into the woods to find the source of the singing. I asked him if he believed that. He said, I believe that stories from indigenous peoples about danger in specific places are usually rooted in something real. I believe that our grandfather knew something that we have forgotten. The path continued downward. We finally reached what appeared to be the end point of the trail. It was marked by a stone cairn that had been positioned to indicate a junction point. Beyond the cairn, the forest opened into a wider space, a kind of natural amphitheater formed by the geological structure of the hollow. The rock formations rose on three sides, creating a natural bowl. And it was there, in the center of that bowl, that we first saw the structure. It was not natural. I can say that with absolute certainty. It was too regular, too intentional, too alien to the forest that surrounded it. It appeared to be made of wood and stone in equal measure, constructed in a spiral pattern that seemed to rise approximately 12 feet from the ground. The construction was ancient. The wood had the gray, weathered appearance of something that had been exposed to the elements for centuries. The stone was fitted with an exactness that suggested tools more sophisticated than anything the European colonists would have brought to the region in the 1700s. Harper approached it first. He said, "Someone built this, perhaps in the 19th century, perhaps earlier. We need to document it and report its existence." Mia was examining the stone structure with her surveying equipment. She said, "The lichen on these stones is not consistent with the timeline that would place this construction in the 19th century or even the 18th. Based on the lichen growth patterns and the weathering of the surface, I would estimate this structure is several hundred years old at minimum, possibly much older." Charlotte was recording the location on our GPS unit. She said, "Coordinates are logged. Harper, we should return and file a preservation report." But Harper was not moving. He was staring at the structure, and specifically at a symbol that had been carved into the base of the spiral. It was a mark that looked almost like a musical note, or perhaps a crooked staff. It was repeated around the entire circumference of the structure, perhaps 20 times. Harper said, "I know this symbol. I have seen it in photographs of Cherokee ceremonial sites. It appears in the historical records of this region. I need to research what it signifies." The humming had not stopped. It had actually intensified as we approached the structure. It seemed to emanate from the stone and wood itself, vibrating through our chests, resonating in a frequency that made it difficult to think clearly. Alexander said, "We need to document all of this and move back to base camp. It is getting late, and we should not traverse these woods in darkness." He was right. The sun was low on the horizon. We had been hiking for approximately 9 hours. We were tired, and the humming was making all of us increasingly anxious, though no one wanted to admit it directly. Harper said, "We will document everything with photographs. We will mark this location with a preservation flag, and we will return to base camp. Tomorrow we will file the reports and request a halt to the public opening of this trail until we can research what this structure represents and what its purpose is." So we documented it. We took photographs from multiple angles. We marked it with the preservation flag that was standard issue, and we turned back toward the direction we had come. It took us 6 hours to return to the trailhead. It should have taken us 4 hours. We kept getting turned around. The path seemed different in the direction we were traveling. Twice we had to backtrack because we had gone up an incorrect feeder trail. The forest was confusing us, or perhaps the forest was delaying us. By the time we reached the ranger station, it was nearly midnight. We were all exhausted. We filed preliminary reports and went to our sleeping quarters. I could not sleep. None of us could, I learned later, because the humming continued. Even at the ranger station, which was approximately 5 miles from the base of the trail, we could hear it. It was not loud. It was not intrusive in the way that sound usually is, but it was present. It was in the background of everything, a constant low vibration that you could feel more than hear. And I realized, lying in my bunk at 2 in the morning, that the humming had changed. It was no longer making random variations. It was developing a pattern. It was almost like it was learning how to form syllables. It was learning how to sing words that human ears could comprehend. By the next morning, I knew that whatever that structure was, it had been triggered by our presence, and the woodland crooner was beginning to hunt. The next day was unusual in ways that were initially subtle. The team gathered for breakfast at 6 in the morning, which was our standard protocol. Everyone was tired. Everyone had circles under their eyes. No one had slept well. Harper called an emergency meeting in the main office. He said, "I have researched the symbol we found. I have contacted colleagues in the university system and shared the photographs. The symbol is indeed Cherokee in origin, but it represents something specific. It represents a warning. Specifically, it represents a designation that means something in the region should not be approached or disturbed. Mia said, "You are suggesting that structure was a warning marker." Harper said, "I am suggesting that structure was a containment marker. It was built as a warning to stay away. And we activated it yesterday when we approached it directly and lingered in the vicinity." Daniel said, "That is folklore. That is superstition. We are rangers, not believers in ancient superstition." Harper said, "I am a ranger who has served in these mountains for 20 years, and I am telling you that the Cherokee people, who knew these mountains better than anyone, built that structure with intention, and that intention was to keep people away from something in that hollow." Charlotte said, "What kind of something?" Harper did not answer immediately. He was holding a folder with printed articles. He said, "Between the years of 1895 and 1912, there were 11 disappearances in this region. Young men, primarily, between the ages of 16 and 25. They vanished during hiking expeditions or while being alone in the forest. The official reports indicate they were lost or suffered accidents. But the local records, the records kept by the families and the town historians, tell a different story. The story is that the men heard something in the forest, something that called to them, and they followed it into the woods and did not return." Alexander said, "We should close the trail immediately. We should contact the park authority and halt the opening." Lucas was quiet. He was looking at the photographs we had taken of the structure. He said, "That symbol, it is also the same symbol that appears in the accounts of the disappearances. The families who lost sons and brothers in those years reported that they heard humming before the disappearances. They heard voices in the night. And before the men disappeared, they said they had begun to hear their names being called." The room went silent. Charlotte asked, "Their names? How is that possible? How could a natural phenomenon or an animal mimic human voices and call people by their names?" Lucas said, "It would not be possible if it was a natural phenomenon or an animal. But what if it was something that could learn? What if it was something that could listen to people and then reproduce the sounds it heard, including human speech?" Harper said, "We are not going to sit here and discuss mythology and folklore. We are going to follow protocol. We are going to close the trail pending an investigation. We are going to contact the park authority, and we are going to document everything that we have found." But that night, something changed. The humming became more distinct, and woven through it were sounds that made my blood go cold, because woven through the humming were voices, human voices. They were calling names. They were calling out in voices that sounded like people from the region, like locals, like the old families who had lived in those mountains for generations. Harper heard it. He called us all into the main office at 2 in the morning. He said, "All of you can hear this?" We all nodded. The sound was too distinct to deny. It was no longer a background hum, it was a chorus, a song made of many voices, all singing the same melody. But each voice was a different person calling. And each voice was calling names. I heard my grandfather's voice calling my name. My grandfather, who had died 15 years prior. His voice was distinct, unmistakable, calling to me from somewhere in the forest. Mia heard her sister. Charlotte heard her father. Daniel heard his mother. Alexander heard his son. Henry heard his uncle. Amelia heard her husband. Matthew heard his brother. The only one who did not speak about hearing a specific voice was Lucas. When Harper asked him directly, Lucas said, "I hear multiple voices. I hear many people. I think it is learning faster now. It is learning to speak in more voices. I think it is getting better at calling." Harper said, "Everyone remains inside the station. No one goes out into the forest under any circumstances. This is a direct order." We obeyed, but the voices continued. They called throughout the night, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, always present. And gradually the sounds became more distinct. The voices were not just saying our names anymore. They were saying things our loved ones had said. They were repeating phrases and sentences that only we would know. My grandfather's voice began to call out specific memories. It said, "Remember when we went fishing at Mill Creek and you fell in the water? Remember how cold it was? Remember how I pulled you out? I am in the water still. I am in the cold still. Come back to the water." At 4 in the morning, I realized something was wrong with Harper. He was standing at the window of the office, staring out into the dark forest. I said his name multiple times and he did not respond. It was as though he was in a trance state. I touched his shoulder and he turned to look at me. His eyes were unfocused. He said, "I have to go. I have to go into the forest. She is waiting. My wife is waiting." She says she is alone and cold and she needs me to come to her. I held his arm and said, Harper, your wife is alive. She is asleep in your house in town. This is a trick. This is something trying to lure you out. He seemed to struggle with my words as though he was fighting against an impulse that was overwhelming his rational mind. Finally, he said, You are right. You are right. But it is so hard to resist. The voice is so clear. It sounds exactly like her. It sounds exactly the way she sounds when she is frightened. By dawn, we were all becoming affected, not just by the voices, but by the actual physical urge to go out into the forest. It was like a pressure in our chests, a constant pull toward the trees, toward the darkness, toward the place where the voices were calling from. Henry was the first one to break. At sunrise, he walked to the door and said, I am going out. I have to go out. I cannot stay here anymore. Harper tried to stop him. Henry was stronger. He pushed past Harper and opened the door. He stepped out into the early morning light, and immediately the voices changed. They began to sing. All of them together, all the voices that had been calling individual names, began to sing as one. The melody was beautiful and terrible and alien. It was a song that made you want to weep and scream at the same time. And Henry walked toward the sound. He did not run. He did not seem distressed. He simply walked in the direction of the voices, deeper into the forest, and we did not see him again. Harper locked all the doors after that. He said, No one leaves this building. That is a direct order. No matter what you hear, no matter how real it sounds, no matter what the voices promise you, no one leaves this building. But even as he said it, we all knew the order was not going to hold forever. The voices were getting stronger. The pressure was getting stronger. And soon we were going to have to make a choice between staying in the locked building and going out to find the source of the calling. The question was whether any of us would make it back. By the second day of the calling, we had lost 2 more people. Amelia was the second to leave. She made it to the door at approximately 9 in the morning, and this time Harper did not try to stop her. He was too weak. We were all too weak. The constant pressure, the constant sound, the constant voices calling our names, it was draining us. It was breaking us down in a way that physical exhaustion could not begin to match. When Amelia opened the door, the song changed again. The voices shifted and adapted. Now they were calling with Amelia's voice. Amelia's voice was calling Amelia deeper into the forest. Her own voice, perfectly reproduced, saying things that she had said in moments of vulnerability, moments of grief or pain that she had never shared with the team. She left. The voices continued. Daniel left at approximately 2 in the afternoon. He made it about 50 yards from the station before we lost sight of him in the trees. The voices had adopted his own voice by then as well, a choir of versions of himself, all calling in harmonies that should not have been possible with a single human throat. By evening, Charlotte said she was leaving. Harper tried to physically restrain her, but she fought him with a strength that came from desperation. She said, I have to see my father. I have to know if he is real, if he is really out there, if he is really calling me. I cannot spend another night in this building not knowing if there is a chance he is alive, if there is a chance I can see him again. We could not stop her. We let her go. That left Harper, Lucas, Mia, Alexander, and myself. The humming had changed the color of the forest outside. It was not a literal change, not something in the light itself, but the forest looked wrong. The trees seemed closer than they had been before. The shadows were deeper. The paths through the woods seemed to shift and rearrange when you looked at them. Lucas had moved beyond fear into a kind of resigned acceptance. He said, It is learning from us. Every time someone leaves, every time someone goes out into that forest, it learns more about how to sound human. It is becoming better at the imitation. In a few more days, it might be indistinguishable from actual human voices. Alexander said, Then we need to leave. We need to find a way to escape this place and reach civilization and get help. Mia said, And go where? We are 5 miles from the nearest town, and whatever is out there in that forest, it knows every trail, every path, every route back to town. If we leave this building, we are walking into its domain. We are walking into the place where it has had hundreds of years to establish its hunting ground. Lucas said, It has not been hunting for hundreds of years. The structure that Harper found, the Cherokee warning marker, that is not ancient, that is probably 400 or 500 years old at most, but it is possible that the thing itself is much older. Perhaps the Cherokee found it and built the structure to contain it. And then, over the centuries, the knowledge of why the marker existed was lost. People forgot. People opened the path. I said, How do you know so much about this? Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Because my grandfather was not just telling me folklore. He was telling me family history, my family's history. The woodland crooner did not appear in the 1895 to 1912 disappearances. There were disappearances before that. There were disappearances in my family going back to the 1800s. My family settled on the edges of these mountains, and my family learned to stay away from the deep hollows. My grandfather was warning me. I should have listened more carefully. Harper said, "Why did you not tell us this before? Why did you not tell me about this when we were planning the new trail?" Lucas said, "Because I was a young ranger who wanted to prove himself. I wanted to believe that the old stories were just stories. I wanted to believe that my family was wrong, that we were superstitious, that the modern world had moved beyond the need for old warnings. I was wrong." That night, we heard the voices of those we had lost. Henry was calling for help. Amelia was singing in a voice that was not quite her own anymore, something that was trying to be human but had lost some essential quality in the translation. Daniel was laughing, not with joy but with a sound that was wrong, that echoed in ways laughter should not echo. And underneath all of their voices, underneath the choir of the dead or the converted or whatever they had become, we heard something else. We heard the original sound. We heard the voice that had been singing before human voices were ever added to the song. It was ancient, it was vast. It was trying to speak in a language that preceded human language. Harper broke down at midnight. He said, "I have to go. I have to find them. I have to see what has happened to them." Alexander said, "Harper, you cannot go out there." Harper said, "I am the senior ranger. I am responsible for this team. I have failed them. I have failed to protect them. I have to go to them, and I have to do what I can." And he left. He walked out of the station without anyone trying to stop him. Perhaps we were too tired. Perhaps we were too afraid. Perhaps we understood that keeping him here would only prolong his suffering. That left 4 of us, Mia, Alexander, Lucas, and myself. The voices called throughout the next day. The voices of Harper joined the choir. The voices of all 7 people who had left the station were now singing in the song. They were singing different parts, different melodies, but they were all singing the same underlying composition. And the song was growing more complex. Each voice added new dimensions to it. The song was no longer just calling, it was telling a story. It was describing the forest in ways that a human mind could almost comprehend, but not quite. It was describing the experience of being absorbed into something vast and ancient and alien. By the morning of the 3rd day, Alexander said, "We have to try to leave. We have to try to reach the town. We cannot stay here." Mia said, "If we leave, we will be hunted. It will follow us." Alexander said, "It is not leaving us alone anyway. It is calling us every moment. It is learning from us. Eventually, it will break into this station, or we will become so desperate that we will walk out willingly." I realized he was right. The pressure was not diminishing. If anything, it was increasing. And I could feel myself becoming less resistant to it. I could feel the will to resist eroding like stone underwater. I said, "We will wait until dark. We will gather supplies. We will attempt to reach the ranger outpost to the east. It is only 3 miles away. If we can reach it, we can call for help." So we spent the day preparing. We gathered water and food. We prepared a route that did not follow the main trail, that instead went through the heaviest forest, the most difficult terrain. Our theory was that the crooner would expect us to follow the established paths. If we went off trail, we might avoid the worst of its attention. It was a desperate plan. It was based on assumptions that we could not verify. But it was the only plan we had. When the sun went down on the 3rd day, we made our decision to leave. Lucas said, "I will lead. I know this forest. I know the paths that the locals used before the official trails were established. There are routes through these mountains that predate the National Park Service. These routes might not be in the crooner's territory." I said, "You are assuming it has a territory. You are assuming there are places it cannot go." Lucas said, "The Cherokee people built a marker to contain it. They thought it could be contained. Perhaps that means there are limitations. Perhaps it is bound to the deep hollows where the structure stands. Perhaps it is restricted to the areas where it has been feeding for centuries. I do not know. But the assumption that there are no safe places is less useful than the assumption that there might be boundaries." Mia said, "If the marker was built to contain it, and we broke that containment by opening the trail and approaching the structure, then perhaps we can restore the containment. Perhaps we can return to the structure and seal it again, or at least place new warnings." Alexander said, "One problem. We do not know how to seal it. We do not know what the original ritual was. And even if we did, returning to the deep hollow is exactly what it wants. It is waiting for us there. The 7 people who left would lead us there if they could. They would do anything to bring us closer to it. So our plan was simple. We would leave in the darkness. We would move north, away from the structure, away from Grief Hollow. We would attempt to reach the ranger outpost at Harrow Ridge, and once we reached it, we would radio for emergency services and relay what had happened. The plan had only one fatal flaw. We were operating on the assumption that the woodland crooner was not already aware of our intentions. We waited until 11 at night. The voices had been calling for 24 hours at a constant volume, adapting to our silence, finding new songs, new melodies, new ways to penetrate our resistance. But at 11, we packed our supplies and opened the back door of the station. The forest was black. There was no moon. The stars were hidden behind clouds. We could not see more than a few feet in front of us. We had flashlights, but we had decided not to use them unless absolutely necessary. The light would make us visible. The light would draw attention. Lucas led us forward into the trees. He was moving carefully, feeling his way, following paths that only he seemed to be able to perceive. Behind him came Mia, then Alexander, then me. For the first 20 minutes we encountered nothing. The forest was silent, there were no voices, there was no humming, there was only the sound of our footsteps and our breathing. And then Lucas stopped. He said, "There is a light ahead. There should not be a light ahead." I moved up beside him. Ahead of us, through the trees, there was indeed a light. It was not a flashlight. It was not artificial light in any way that I could recognize. It was a soft, luminous glow, coming from what appeared to be the clearing near the old ranger lookout that had been abandoned in the 1970s. Alexander said, "It is a natural phenomenon, bioluminescence from fungi. We have heard of it in other forests." But Lucas shook his head. The light was moving. It was not a static glow. It was moving through the forest, moving in patterns that seemed almost like dancing. And then we heard them. We heard all 7 voices. We heard Henry and Amelia and Daniel and Charlotte and Harper and all the others. They were singing, and they were singing our names. They were singing the names of all 3 of us who remained at the station. Mia said, "We have to keep moving. We cannot stop." So we kept moving, but we changed our direction. We moved away from the light, away from the voices, trying to maintain our northward direction while avoiding the singing that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. And as we walked, I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The woodland crooner was not pursuing us. We were already in its domain. We had been in its domain since we first approached the structure. The ranger station had not protected us. It had only delayed the inevitable. Lucas seemed to realize the same thing. He said, "We are walking in circles. The forest keeps turning us. Every path leads back toward the singing." Alexander said, "That is impossible. We are navigating by compass and by the stars when we can see them." But it was happening. Every time we thought we were moving in a straight line, every time we felt confident about our direction, the forest would shift. The trees would rearrange themselves. The paths that Lucas had known, the old routes through the mountains, they were all leading us in the same direction. They were all leading us back toward Grief Hollow. Mia said, "It is not the forest. It is in our heads. It is affecting our perception. It is making us think we are going in one direction when we are actually going in another." I realized she was right. I could feel it. I could feel the influence pressing against my mind, like a hand on my skull, gently guiding my thoughts, my decisions, my perceptions. The woodland crooner was not just singing. It was reaching into our minds. We had been walking for approximately 4 hours when we realized where we were. We recognized the white rhododendron field. We had returned to the approach to Grief Hollow, and the singing was louder now. The voices of the 7 had been joined by new voices, or perhaps they had split, multiplying like fractured mirrors, each voice creating echoes of itself until there was a chorus that seemed to contain hundreds of distinct tones. Lucas said, "We have to make a decision. We can continue trying to escape, and we will only be led back here again, or we can enter the hollow and approach the structure. We can accept what is happening." Alexander said, "No, we keep fighting, we keep moving, we do not surrender." But even as he said it, his resistance was crumbling. I could see it in his face. I could feel it in myself as well. The pressure to stop, to surrender, to walk toward the voices and join them in their singing. It was becoming almost unbearable. And then Mia said something that changed everything. She said the Cherokee people, they did not try to contain it. They tried to establish rules with it. The structure, the marker, the symbol. These are not warnings. These are contracts. They are agreements. Lucas said, "What are you talking about?" Mia said, "The disappearances ended. You said yourself that the disappearances occurred between 1895 and 1912, And then they stopped. They stopped because the people in this region reached an understanding with the crooner. They agreed to leave it alone, to mark its territory, to warn outsiders away. And in exchange, it limited its hunting. It did not take more than a certain number of people per generation. It created a sustainable relationship, Harper said. It killed 11 people in 17 years. That is not sustainable. That is predation, Mia said. For a region and a creature. For a creature that has been alive for possibly thousands of years, 11 people per generation might indeed be sustainable, might indeed be the price of coexistence that the local people agreed to. Alexander said, "You are suggesting we make a deal with this thing. You are suggesting we negotiate with it." Mia said, "I am suggesting that it is intelligent enough to negotiate. I am suggesting that it has done so before, and I am suggesting that our only chance of surviving this is to offer it something it wants." As we stood in the white rhododendron field, surrounded by the singing of 7 voices that were no longer quite human, Mia made an offer to the darkness. She said, "We do not want to join them. We do not want to be absorbed into your song, but we are offering ourselves to you anyway. We are offering you knowledge. We are offering you 3 minds that can help you understand the modern world. The world beyond this hollow. The world that has changed since the 1900s. The singing stopped. For the first time in 3 days, the constant humming, the constant voices, fell silent. The silence was absolute. It was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, my own blood moving through my veins. And then a new voice spoke. It was not a human voice. It was not even a voice in the traditional sense. It was a sound that was somehow directly in my mind, that bypassed my ears and seemed to resonate in my thoughts. It said, 3 minds, 3 perspectives, 3 memories. Mia said, "In exchange, let one of us go. Let one of us return to the world above with a message. Let us place new markers. Let us re-establish the agreement that was made a century ago. Let us ensure that the trail is closed and that no one else comes into this hollow." The creature considered. I could feel it, the immense intelligence pressing against my consciousness, evaluating, calculating, deciding. And then it said, 1. One must go. One must return. One must carry the knowledge. Lucas said, "I will go. I have family in the towns above. I can ensure the markers are placed correctly. I can protect the hollow." The creature's presence shifted. It addressed him directly, and I could feel it, the weight of its attention, the force of an intelligence that was not bound by the limitations of human perception. It said, "You know the hollow. You know the stories. You know the danger. You will be the voice that warns. You will be the voice that maintains the contract. Yes, you will go." Lucas said, "What about them? What about Mia and Alexander?" The creature said, "They will remain. They will become part of the song. Their voices will be added. Their knowledge will be absorbed. And through them, I will understand the world that exists beyond this forest." Alexander said, "Mia, there has to be another way." Mia said, "There is not. And on some level, you understand that. We opened the path. We violated the contract that was established 100 years ago. We broke something that should not have been broken. This is the price." She turned to me. "And you," she said, "you will also go. You were the first to realize that something was wrong. You will be the voice that corroborates Lucas's account. You will be the voice that gives weight to the warning." I said, "Why would it release both of us?" The creature spoke again. "1 voice is a warning. 2 voices are evidence. 3 voices would be a conspiracy. 2 is sufficient to establish truth. 2 is the minimum necessary to alter the behavior of those who read this account in the future. You will go. Both of you." Alexander said, "Then I will stay. I will be the 3rd voice. I will become part of the song so that they can tell people what happened." Mia said, "No. You have a daughter. You have family. You have responsibilities in the world above. You will go with them." The creature said, 4 cannot go. The contract requires payment. 2 is the agreed number. You are 3. 3 cannot all leave. But I will be generous because of the knowledge you offer. I will accept only 1, the eldest, the one called Mia, the one with the most extensive understanding of the systems that sustain the world above. I realized what was happening. The creature was negotiating with us. It was holding to a contract framework, even though we had not negotiated with it before. It was revealing that it had intelligence, language, and an understanding of logic and agreement. Mia did not hesitate. She said, "I will stay. Lucas, you will lead them out. You will tell them everything. You will make them understand what we discovered in those woods." And with that, Mia turned and walked toward the singing. She did not run. She did not seem frightened. She simply walked deeper into the hollow, in the direction of the voices, in the direction of the 7 people who had come before her. The singing resumed. But this time there was a new voice in it, and the quality of the singing changed. It became more complex, more layered, more impossible to describe in human terms. The voice of Mia was being translated into something that was not human speech, something that was not language as humans understood it. Lucas said, "We have to go. We have to leave now." So we left. We ran. We did not follow any path. We simply went upward, toward the slopes that would take us out of Grief Hollow, and back toward the ranger station and the roads that led to the town. It took us approximately 3 hours to reach the ranger station. When we arrived, the door was still unlocked. The building was empty except for the supplies we had left behind. We did not stay longer than necessary. We gathered what we needed, including the documentation of the trail system, the GPS coordinates of the structure, and the photographs we had taken. And then we left the ranger station permanently. We reported the incident to the park authority. We told them that the trail needed to be closed. We told them that a structural anomaly had been discovered in Grief Hollow that required preservation attention. We did not tell them about the voices. We did not tell them about the singing. We did not tell them about the creature that had bargained with us, that had accepted Mia's sacrifice in exchange for our freedom. We reported the 6 rangers missing or dead. We reported them as victims of an unknown hazard in the deep forest. The park authority conducted a search, but they found nothing. No bodies, no remains, no evidence of what had happened. Lucas and I submitted reports that were carefully worded, that avoided any mention of the supernatural elements of our experience, that instead focused on the environmental anomalies and the structural discovery. The trail was officially closed 6 weeks later. The park authority sealed the entrance with barriers and posted warnings. No tourists have accessed Grief Hollow since that time. I left my position as a ranger 2 months after the incident. I could not return to those mountains knowing what was waiting in them. I could not forget the singing. Lucas remained. He became the unofficial guardian of the boundary that marks Grief Hollow. He placed warning signs in the old language, the Cherokee language, in addition to the official English warnings. He ensured that the old agreement was maintained. And 5 years later, I am telling you this account because I believe that people need to understand the price of ignorance. Mia is still singing somewhere in that hollow. Charlotte is still singing. Henry, Amelia, Daniel, Harper, and Matthew are all still singing. They are part of something ancient and intelligent and powerful. And in the darkness of deep forests, if you listen carefully, you might hear their voices still. You might hear them calling names. You might hear them learning to speak in new voices, new languages, new ways to communicate with the world above. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Appalachian Mountains, in the deep hollows where the oldest trees grow, listen for the humming, listen for the singing, and if you hear it, do not ignore the warning. Do not assume it is wind or geological phenomenon. Do not convince yourself that it is something that can be explained by modern science. Because the woodland crooner exists, it has existed for longer than recorded history, and it has learned, through centuries of silence and containment, how to be patient, how to be subtle, how to call people deeper into the forest with voices they cannot resist. The trail to Grief Hollow is closed now, but the Forest Service is always under pressure to expand public access. There are always plans to open new trails, to venture deeper into the wilderness, to make the mountains more accessible to tourism. If those plans ever succeed, if another trail is ever cut into the deep hollows, then the crooner will have another opportunity to expand its feeding ground. And I wonder sometimes, late at night, whether Mia understood this when she volunteered to stay, whether she realized that her sacrifice might ultimately be insufficient, whether she knew that the creature was not truly bound by the old agreements, but was instead waiting for another chance to hunt, waiting for another group of explorers to venture into the forbidden places. I have spent 5 years hoping that Lucas will be able to maintain the boundary. I have spent 5 years listening for the singing in the darkness, wondering if the voices are getting closer, wondering if they are beginning to spread beyond the hollow. And every spring, when the weather warms and the hiking season begins, I think about the thousands of people who will venture into the Appalachian forests. I think about how many of them will hear the humming. I think about how many will resist it and how many will follow it. Subscribe to this channel if you want to know what I discover. Share this account with others who spend time in deep forests. Place your own warnings where you can, because the only thing standing between the world above and the woodland crooner is a century-old agreement maintained by one man, and the constant hope that the creature will remain satisfied with the voices it already possesses. That hope becomes harder to maintain with each passing year. I have been studying the journals and recordings left behind by 10 young people who ventured into the woodlands surrounding Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the autumn of 2019. What I am about to share with you is their account, reconstructed from their own words, their video logs, and the notes they frantically scribbled during those 4 days they spent in the mountains. The official investigation concluded that they became lost and suffered from exposure. That explanation is incomplete. I have decided to release their testimony in full, so that you can understand what truly happened in those dark forests where something older than memory still walks on 2 legs and wears the face of your friend. My name is James Carter, and I was 15 years old when this story began. I have to tell you about how we came to be in that place, because it matters. Nothing happens in isolation. There are always signs before something terrible arrives, little moments that seem innocent until they become markers of a line you should never have crossed. It started in September of that year. Emma Wilson, who was 16 and lived 2 streets over from me, had become obsessed with cryptid folklore. Her bedroom walls were covered with printed articles about Mothman sightings, grainy photographs of alleged Bigfoot tracks, and maps of reported skinwalker territories. Most of us thought it was a phase. Most of us were wrong. Emma convinced her older cousin Liam Harris to organize what she called a camping expedition. Liam was 17, already working part-time at an automotive shop, and he had access to a truck and the kind of confidence that comes from being the oldest of a group. He did not take the folklore seriously. He thought it would be fun. He thought Emma was interesting and strange, and he wanted to impress her. Liam brought his friend Olivia Clark into the planning. Olivia was 18, a senior in high school with the kind of quiet intelligence that made people listen when she spoke. She agreed to the camping trip because she was good at planning logistics and someone needed to be responsible. The 5 of them became the core of the group. There was also Noah Lewis, 19, who worked at the local grocery store and had a truck of his own. He wanted to go because the others were going, though he never admitted this directly. Then Emma added more people. Ava Walker was 20, technically an adult, though she had not quite left behind the feeling of being a teenager still making decisions based on what other people thought. William Hall was 21 and attended the community college an hour away. He had returned home for the weekend and agreed to join without fully understanding what he had agreed to. Sophia Allen was 22, already working in the administrative office of the county courthouse, a person with real responsibilities who probably should have known better than to take 4 days off for a camping trip she did not believe in. Benjamin Young was 23 and had recently moved back to the area after a failed attempt at living in Pennsylvania. He was looking for a reason to feel part of something again. Isabella King, the oldest of us at 24, worked as a nurse at the regional hospital. She had seen enough of human fragility that she did not fear what she could not explain. She thought a few days in the wilderness would be refreshing. She thought wrong. Liam spent the last 2 weeks of September researching locations. Emma had been very specific about where she wanted to go. She wanted Point Pleasant. She had read about the Mothman sightings that had occurred there in 1966 and 1967. The humanoid creature with enormous wings and hypnotic red eyes that appeared in the area just before the Silver Bridge collapsed. Emma believed that something was still there. She believed that the Mothman was just one of many things that inhabited those mountains. Entities that the indigenous people had known about for thousands of years. Entities that the white settlers had learned about only through the terror of encounter. Emma had found something else during her research, a reference to skinwalkers, not the Navajo creatures of the American Southwest, but something else. Something that had been reported in the Ohio River Valley. A figure that appeared human until it was too late to run. A thing that wore the faces of people you knew, that could mimic their voices, that hunted at dusk and dawn in the spaces between the civilized world and the wild. I remember when she first told me about it. We were sitting in the parking lot after school on a Thursday in late September. The October air was already turning cold at night, and leaves were beginning to yellow on the trees that bordered the athletic fields. Emma opened her laptop and turned the screen toward me. She had been writing something, not sharing sources or articles, but her own thoughts, her own interpretation of reports she had collected. Skinwalkers are not just Southwest, she said. That is a popular misconception. The phenomenon is older than tribal boundaries. The Appalachian people knew about them. The early settlers wrote about them in journals. There was one sighting in 1887 near Charleston, West Virginia. A man reported that his brother came home from a hunting trip 3 hours late. The man who came home looked like his brother, moved like his brother, even knew things only his brother would know. But something was wrong with the way he moved his head. Something was wrong with how he smiled. The man shot his brother. He shot him and the thing that was wearing his brother fell down, and when it hit the ground it sounded wrong. It did not sound like meat and bone. It sounded like something hollow. I asked her if she believed this was real. Emma looked at me for a long moment before answering. I believe, she said, that we do not understand what lives in the dark, and I believe that our lack of understanding does not make these things any less real. Liam had chosen a location carefully. It was not directly in Point Pleasant, but in the vast wilderness area about 20 miles northeast, in the hills and forests that surrounded the town. It was accessible by a logging road that had not been maintained in several years. There was a clearing, maybe 2 miles from the road, that could accommodate our camp. It was isolated enough to feel authentic to the experience we were seeking. It was far enough from help that if something went wrong, we would be alone with it. We departed on a Friday morning in late October. The weather was shifting. There had been frost on the car windows when I woke up. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was high and the afternoon was warmer, but the air held the promise of cold once night fell. Liam's truck could fit 6 people, though it was crowded. Noah drove separately in his own vehicle. Emma had insisted on keeping everyone together as much as possible, though she had not explained her reasoning. William, Sophia, Benjamin, and Isabella followed in William's sedan. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we had reached the clearing. It took us 90 minutes to walk from the vehicles, following a path that grew less distinct as we moved deeper into the forest. The path had been used recently, but not heavily. Animal tracks crossed it frequently. There was the scat of deer, the scat of something larger that none of us could identify. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 40 meters across. A creek ran along the eastern edge, the water cold and clear and moving rapidly over smooth stones. There were the remains of old fires here, blackened stones arranged in circles, charred wood that had been burning for no more than a year or two. Good, Liam said, setting down his backpack. We are not the first ones who have found this place. That is not necessarily a good thing, Olivia observed. She was already unpacking the camping equipment with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, perhaps with her parents or with the Girl Scouts when she was younger. We set up camp methodically. 2 large tents, sleeping bags arranged inside, a central fire pit. Emma had brought specialized camping equipment, the kind that was expensive, and suggested she had been planning this for months, possibly longer. She had brought a satellite messaging device, a backup power system, and what appeared to be equipment for recording audio and video in low-light conditions. Why do you have all this? I asked her, watching as she organized a battery pack and a professional quality microphone. Because, she said, if something happens, I want it documented. I want evidence. People dismiss stories that come from nothing but words. But if you have recording, if you have data, that becomes harder to dismiss. By 5 o'clock, our camp was established and dinner was being prepared. Sophia had insisted on cooking, and she had brought ingredients for a hearty stew that would take 2 hours to prepare over the campfire. As we waited, the light began to change. The sun, which had been warm and forgiving in the afternoon, turned orange and then red as it descended toward the horizon. The temperature dropped noticeably. People began putting on jackets and sweaters. Benjamin produced a bottle of whiskey that he had brought without telling Liam. They shared it around the circle, and the whiskey seemed to ease some of the nervousness that was becoming apparent in the group. People laughed louder. Conversations became more animated. The wilderness, which had seemed slightly intimidating in the afternoon, felt less threatening now that we were warm and together, with the promise of food soon to come. I sat between Noah and Isabella, watching the fire build. The flames were orange and gold, and they cast dancing shadows across the faces of the people I had known for most of my life. Yet in the firelight, these familiar people seemed somehow transformed. The shadows deepened the lines of their faces. The uncertainty of the light made their expressions harder to read. Sophia announced that dinner was ready, and we ate from bowls balanced on our laps, the stew hot and complex and comforting. The conversation turned to why we were here, what we were hoping to find. We probably will not find anything, William said. He was the practical one among us, the one who worked with his hands and did not believe in things he could not hold or fix. But if we do find something, we should just leave it alone. Disturbing wildlife is not a good idea. We are not looking for wildlife, Emma said quietly. We are looking for something that might be looking for us. The fire crackled. Someone made a nervous joke. The light began to fade from the sky more rapidly, and the trees that surrounded our clearing became indistinct silhouettes against the darkening blue above them. Olivia checked her phone. There was no signal, which was expected. But she had taken a screenshot of a map before we lost connection, and she had been marking our location mentally. "We are here," she said, pointing to an area on the map that seemed impossibly small and fragile, surrounded by so much wilderness. "Nearest help is about 5 miles south. If something happens, we signal for help and we move toward that road." "Nothing is going to happen," Noah said, but he said it without conviction. The night deepened. The stars came out. First a few scattered points of light, then more, then an incredible display of stars that you cannot see in the town because of the light pollution. The Milky Way stretched across the sky above us, and under that immensity of light and darkness, our fire seemed very small and our tent seemed very fragile. Gradually, people began to drift toward sleep. Ava and Emma shared one tent. Olivia and Sophia shared the other. The rest of us arranged ourselves around the fire, some attempting to sleep in camping chairs, others lying on sleeping bags in the open air around the perimeter of the camp. I did sleep, fitfully, moving in and out of consciousness as the fire burned down and the night grew colder. At some point, someone must have added wood to the flames because the fire was still burning when I woke, though less brightly than before. It was the sound that woke me. A sound that did not belong in the darkness. A sound that was not the wind or the creek or the normal sounds of the wilderness. It was the sound of something walking on two legs, moving deliberately through the undergrowth beyond the circle of firelight. The walking sound continued for maybe 30 seconds. It was not hurried. It did not seem to be moving away from us. It moved with a kind of deliberate pace, as though whatever was making the sound was evaluating us, deciding something about us, the way a predator might circle prey. I sat up slowly. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness now. The others were waking too. I could see Liam stirring in his sleeping bag, Sophia's silhouette in the tent opening. Then the sound stopped. For the next few minutes there was nothing but silence and the sound of the creek and the whisper of wind in the upper branches of the trees. We waited, and the waiting was somehow worse than the sound had been because waiting means anticipation, and anticipation means fear. "Probably a deer," William said, but he too was sitting up now, alert. "Maybe an elk. They can sound almost like people moving sometimes." "Elk does not have the gait pattern of a biped," Emma said. She had been sleeping lightly, or perhaps she had not been sleeping at all. She was already standing, moving to the fire pit and adding more wood. The flames rose higher, extending the circle of visible ground around our camp, pushing the darkness further back. "We do not have elk in this part of West Virginia," Olivia added. "Exactly," Liam said. There was an edge to his voice that I had not heard before. "So it was a deer or a bear. We are in a wilderness area. We are supposed to be unsettled sometimes. That is part of the experience." But no one seemed fully convinced. We remained awake, sitting around the fire, listening to the night. The hours passed. People tried to resume sleeping but did not. The fire consumed the wood we kept adding to it. The next sound, when it came, was different. It was a call, or perhaps something between a call and a laugh. It came from the darkness beyond the eastern edge of the clearing, the direction where the creek flowed. It was unlike any bird call I had ever heard, and unlike any animal sound. It had an almost human quality, but not quite human. It had a falseness to it, as though something was trying to imitate the sound of a human call and getting almost all of the details right, but not quite. Benjamin stood up abruptly. He was holding one of the camping flashlights. "I am going to look," he said. "No," Olivia said flatly. "We stay together. We stay in the camp. We do not investigate sounds in the darkness in the wilderness." "It is probably an owl," William said, but his voice was weaker now. He did not believe what he was saying. The sound came again, from a different location. It was moving. Whatever was making it had shifted position, was now to the south of our camp, still beyond the visible perimeter but noticeably closer than before. Ava emerged from the tent, pulling her jacket tight around her shoulders. "What was that?" she asked, but we had no answer to give her. Emma remained by the fire, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "I want everyone to listen to me," Olivia said. She was using the kind of voice that people used when they needed to be obeyed. "We are going to get everyone into the tents. We are going to close the tent flaps. We are going to stay inside for the rest of the night. No one leaves the tent for any reason except if there is an immediate emergency. No one investigates sounds. No one goes to the creek. No one does anything except wait for daylight." There was a quality to her command that made us comply. Perhaps it was because she was older. Perhaps it was because she sounded certain in a way that the rest of us were not. Perhaps it was because the thought of having some kind of barrier between us and the darkness was suddenly very appealing. We gathered our sleeping bags and belongings and moved into the tents. Liam and I shared the sleeping area where Noah was already attempting to rest. William and Benjamin squeezed into the space with us. We arranged ourselves like puzzle pieces, bodies close together for warmth and for comfort. Outside, the fire continued to burn. Olivia and Sophia had agreed to maintain it in shifts, staying awake and keeping the flames high. The light from the fire was visible through the semi-transparent fabric of the tent walls. Shadows moved across these walls occasionally, but whether they were from our own people moving around the fire or from something outside, I could not determine. I did not sleep. None of us did. We lay in the darkness of the tent, listening to the night sounds, listening to the sounds of the fire, listening for whatever had been walking around us in the darkness. It came again, the sound of bipedal movement, but this time it was different. It was faster. It was moving in a deliberate pattern around the entire camp, as though something was walking a perimeter, examining our camp from all sides. It would move along one edge of the clearing, then shift to another edge, moving with an unsettling pace that was too fast to be human, but with footfalls that were distinctly bipedal. The sounds continued for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes or so. Eventually they ceased. Whatever had been moving around us had stopped, had perhaps moved away, or had simply decided to stop circling and wait. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, nobody in that tent had slept. We lay in silence, listening to the sounds of birds beginning their morning calls, feeling the temperature start to rise as the sun approached the horizon. When Olivia's voice called out that it was dawn and it was safe to emerge, we did so immediately, stumbling out of the tent like people rising from tombs. The camp looked normal in the daylight. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. Sophia was sitting on a camping chair, her eyes hollow, a coffee cup in her hands. Olivia was beside her, similarly exhausted. "Did you see anything?" Liam asked. "No," Olivia said, "but I heard it. It walked around us at least 3 times. It stayed at the edge of the firelight but did not come closer." "What was it?" Isabella asked. "I do not know," Olivia said. "I do not know what to call it or how to explain it. But I know what I heard." We prepared breakfast in an almost silent manner. People went through the motions of cooking and eating without much conversation. The energy of the previous evening, the sense of adventure and excitement, had been replaced by something else. Something cautious, something afraid. Emma did not eat much. She was on her satellite device, typing something. I asked her what she was doing. "Logging the incident," she said. "Making notes. If we are experiencing something real, we need to document it properly. Date, time, environmental conditions, the sounds we heard and their approximate duration, everything." "You really believe something is out here?" I asked. Emma looked up from the device. "I believe that something made the sounds," she said carefully. "I believe that bipedal creatures walked around our camp in the darkness. I believe that something called out to us that was not a normal animal. Whether that means it is a supernatural entity or simply an animal we cannot identify, I do not know. But I know it was real." By 10 o'clock in the morning, a discussion had begun about whether we should leave. William was in favor of leaving immediately. Benjamin seemed torn. Noah was quiet, as he often was, and offered no opinion. Isabella surprisingly thought we should stay. "We came here to test our assumptions," she said. "Leaving now means we are running away without any useful data. If we are in danger, we should have experienced it last night. We are still alive. Let us stay and try to understand what we encountered." Liam looked at me. I was 17, but I was not a leader like Liam was. I was willing to do whatever the others decided. I was, if I am being honest, also terrified of the darkness that had felt so heavy and present during the night, and I did not want to experience it again. But I did not want to be thought of as a coward either. "I think we should stay," I said, surprising myself. "But maybe we should change our approach. Maybe we should be more careful. Maybe we should establish some rules about what we do and do not do." This pragmatism seemed to settle the group. We would stay, but we would be more methodical. We would establish a watch rotation, with people staying awake in the tent at all times. We would keep the fire burning continuously. We would not wander far from camp. We would stay together in groups of at least 3. Emma proposed something else. "Tonight," she said, "I want to try to document whatever comes. I want to set up the recording equipment. I want to try to capture audio evidence. If we are being visited by something that we cannot explain, we need that evidence." "That might be dangerous," Sophia said. "It might attract attention. It might provoke whatever is out there. It might also prove what we are experiencing," Emma countered. "That has value." We spent the rest of the day exploring the immediate area around our camp, staying within sight of each other, trying to establish a sense of normalcy. We found a small waterfall about a quarter mile from camp. We sat on the rocks near it and ate lunch. We talked about normal things, people back home, classes and work, things that seemed to matter in the civilized world but felt increasingly unreal here in this wilderness. As afternoon progressed, we returned to camp and made preparations for the night. Emma set up her recording equipment, placing the microphone on a small stand near the fire pit, running a cable back to a recording device she had placed in a weatherproof case. She tested the equipment, making sure it was capturing sound clearly. "If something happens tonight," she said, "we will have proof. We will have documentation." But what we were about to experience would not require documentation to be proven. The experience itself would be enough to change all of us, to mark us in ways we did not yet understand. The second night began like the first, with dinner and conversation and the gradual settling of darkness. But there was a different quality to it. We were hyper-aware now of every sound, every movement in the darkness beyond the fire. Some of us jumped at the sounds of normal wildlife. A fox called somewhere to the north, and we all froze. Wind moved through the trees, and we listened intently, trying to determine if it was just wind. Ava sat beside me as the evening deepened. She was shaking slightly, though the night was not particularly cold. "I do not want to be here," she said quietly. "I wanted adventure, but not this kind. Not fear. It might be nothing," I told her, though I did not believe it. "It might be just an animal we do not know. It might be something that will not harm us, or it might be something that has been waiting in the darkness for a very long time," she said. "Waiting for something like us to come stumbling into its territory." The night deepened. The stars emerged. Liam and William maintained the fire, feeding it wood methodically. Sophia and Olivia sat on camping chairs near the center of camp, maintaining the watch. The rest of us arranged ourselves around the perimeter, sleeping fitfully or not sleeping at all. It was around midnight when the calling started. It was Emma's name. Someone was calling her name from the darkness. It was a male voice, familiar sounding. It was calling, "Emma, Emma, where are you?" Emma sat up sharply, her hand going to my arm. I could feel her trembling. "That is my father," she whispered. "That sounds exactly like my father." "Your father is not here," Liam said. He was awake too, alert. "It is whatever has been out there." "I know," Emma said. But she was still staring into the darkness, toward the direction the voice had come from. The voice called again. "Emma, it is Dad. I came to get you. You should not be out here. It is not safe." It was perfect. The accent was right. The tone was right. The cadence of speech was exactly what her father sounded like. I knew Emma's father slightly, had heard him speak perhaps a dozen times. This was him. But it was not him. "Do not answer," Olivia said sharply. "Do not engage with it." "Emma," the voice called, and now it was coming from a different direction. It was coming from the south now, then from the east. It was moving around the camp, and it kept calling her name, kept trying to persuade her that help was coming, that she needed to go meet her father, that she was in danger and he was coming to save her. Emma was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, her hands clenched into fists. She did not call out. She did not respond, but the effort of not responding seemed to take everything she had. Then the voice changed. It started calling out different names. It became Liam's mother, calling his name, then William's father. Then it became Isabella, calling her own name, speaking in her own voice, asking herself to come out, to come to the edge of camp, to walk into the darkness. The voices were perfect. They were accurate beyond what any animal could possibly achieve. They knew our names. They knew our families. They knew details about us that they could not have known. "The recording," Emma gasped. "We are recording this. It will have the recording." "Emma, be quiet," Benjamin said. He was staring into the darkness beyond the fire, his jaw clenched. The voices continued, cycling through all of us, becoming our family members, calling us out into the darkness one by one. The ones who heard themselves called seemed to struggle with the impulse to answer. It was as though the voices had a power over us that transcended logic. A power that appealed to something deeper and more primitive than conscious thought. But none of us answered. None of us left the camp. This continued for maybe an hour. Then, abruptly, the voices stopped. In the sudden silence, we could hear something else. We could hear heavy breathing coming from the edge of the clearing. We could hear the sound of something large moving in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. We could hear what sounded like claws or nails scraping against bark. And then we saw it. It stepped into the firelight. And everything that fear had prepared us for in our imaginings was insufficient for what we were actually seeing. It had the basic shape of a human body. It stood upright on two legs. It had arms and a head and a torso, but the proportions were wrong. The legs were too long. The arms extended too far down the sides of its body. The head was large and misshapen, and where its face should have been there was something that looked like it was trying to be a face but could not quite get the details correct. Its skin, if it could be called skin, appeared to be mottled gray and brown, covered in what might have been hair or might have been some kind of chitinous covering. Its eyes were too large, and they were an amber color that glowed in the firelight with a luminescence that eyes should not have. Its mouth was open slightly, and inside that mouth were too many teeth, and the teeth were wrong. They were not arranged like human teeth. They appeared to be multiple rows of pointed things. It was wearing tatters of clothing that might have once been human garments but which had been reduced to almost nothing by whatever process had created this thing. "My God," Sophia breathed. The thing's head turned toward her. Its eye fixed on her with an intensity that seemed almost physical, as though the gaze itself was a touch. It made a sound. It was not a sound that any creature should be able to make. It was a clicking and a grinding, a sound that came from multiple places in its body at once. Then it moved. It did not run. It moved with a kind of loping gait that seemed to cover ground in a way that physics should not have permitted. It was moving toward the tents, toward the part of our camp where Ava and Emma had been sleeping, toward the part of the camp where 3 of our group were concentrated. Liam grabbed one of the camping flashlights, one of the large ones that put out significant illumination. "Get to the other side of the fire," he shouted. "Move. Move now." We scattered. The thing's attention was divided for a moment, split between the people who were moving and the people it had been approaching. That moment of division was enough. Liam directed the beam of the flashlight directly into the thing's face, flooding its eyes with light. It shrieked. The sound was horrible. It was not like the calling of before, not like the voices of our families. This was a sound of rage and pain and hunger, a sound that seemed to communicate the depth of the thing's anger at being exposed to the light. It moved backward, away from the fire, away from the flashlight, its large form moving with surprising speed back into the darkness. For a moment, we could see its shape against the darkness, its outline against the lesser darkness beyond the clearing. Then it was gone. We stood frozen, waiting, breathing heavily, unable to process what we had just witnessed. "Is everyone here?" Olivia demanded. She was doing a quick count, making sure all 10 of us were accounted for. "Is anyone hurt?" We were all here. No one was injured physically, but something in all of us had been injured in a way that running water and bandages could not address. "We are leaving," William said flatly. "In the morning, we are packing up, we are leaving, and we are not coming back." No one argued. For once, there was complete agreement among the group. The rest of the night was spent sitting closely around the fire, barely moving, barely speaking. We kept the flames high, kept the light bright, and we waited for the dawn. The thing did not return, but we could hear sounds from the darkness, sounds of movement, sounds of calling. Different voices this time, calling different names, trying different approaches. When the sky finally began to lighten, we rose as one unit. We began packing frantically, throwing things into backpacks without much care for organization or method. We wanted to leave. We wanted to get back to civilization. We wanted to be away from this place. But before we could finish, before we could actually depart, something happened that would change everything. We had gotten perhaps a quarter of the way through our packing process when Liam collapsed. One moment he was standing there, rolling up his sleeping bag, and the next moment his legs simply gave way and he fell to the ground. "Liam!" Emma rushed to him, kneeling beside his body. "Liam, what is wrong?" He was conscious but unresponsive. His eyes were open but not tracking anything. His mouth was moving slightly, as though he was trying to speak but could not make his mouth work correctly. Isabella knelt beside him immediately, falling into a professional assessment mode, despite the lack of equipment she normally would have had access to. "Liam, can you hear me? Can you move your fingers?" She checked his pupils, his pulse, his breathing. His heart is racing, his pupils are dilated significantly. "What is wrong with him?" Olivia asked. There was genuine fear in her voice, the kind of fear that comes from something that should not be happening, that violates the normal rules of how the world works. "I do not know," Isabella said. "There is no trauma, no visible injury, but his body is responding as though he is under extreme stress." Over the next few minutes, Liam began to speak, though his words were barely intelligible. He was talking about the thing, about what it had looked like. He kept repeating fragments of words, sounds that suggested he was trying to describe something that his mind was struggling to process. Then he began speaking differently. He began describing things in a way that seemed almost clinical, as though he was reading from a report. He described the creature in detail, detailed anatomical details that none of us could have described because we had not been able to look at it long enough. He described its internal structure, the way its organs were arranged, the composition of its outer integument. "Stop," Isabella said. She looked genuinely disturbed. "Liam, stop talking. You are frightening everyone." "I can see into it," Liam said, his words becoming clearer now, becoming more articulate. "I can see its structure. I can see how it works. I can see the way it thinks." His eyes had changed. I noticed it and wondered if I was imagining it, but as I looked more carefully, I was certain I was not. His pupils seemed larger than they should have been. The amber color that his eyes had always been seemed to be shifting, becoming more golden, becoming more luminescent. "He needs to get away from here," Benjamin said. "He needs to get to medical facility. He needs serious help." We managed to get Liam up, though he was barely able to walk, his legs not responding correctly to his intentions. We helped him toward the path that led back to the vehicles. The journey that had taken 90 minutes with a normal pace took 3 hours because Liam kept stopping, kept seeming to need to rest, though his body was not actually tired so much as it seemed to be fundamentally altered in some way that none of us could understand. As we walked, we noticed something else. Liam's skin was beginning to change. In places it seemed to be hardening, to be taking on that mottled gray and brown coloration that the thing we had seen had possessed. It started at his fingertips and was working its way up his hands. "No," Liam said when he realized this. "No, this is not happening. This is not real. We need to get him to a hospital," Isabella said firmly. "This is beyond anything that camping first aid can address." We pressed on. The path became clearer as we descended, moving back toward the vehicles. Liam was becoming increasingly incoherent, his speech becoming increasingly difficult to understand. He kept touching his skin, feeling where the changes were occurring, making sounds of distress that were unlike anything a human should be able to make. By the time we reached the vehicles, Liam could barely move. We had to support him almost entirely, carrying him between us. His skin was now significantly altered. The changes were spreading across his torso. His face was beginning to shift, subtle changes but disturbing ones, changes that made him look less and less like the Liam we had known. We got him into the back of William's sedan. Liam looked at all of us, and despite everything that was happening to him, he seemed to be conscious enough to understand his situation. "It is in me," he said. "It put something in me. Something is changing me. Something is making me into something else." "We are driving to the nearest hospital," Liam's mother said. She was the one who should have said this, but she was not here. We were here, and we were responsible for him. The drive took 2 hours. William drove at speeds that were significantly above the legal limit, but no police officer appeared to stop him. It was as though the universe itself was conspiring to get Liam to help, to get him to someone who could address what was happening to him. We arrived at the hospital and explained what we could, though much of it sounded insane. We described a camping accident, a fall, a possible allergic reaction. We did not describe the thing we had seen. We did not describe the changes we were observing in Liam's body. The hospital staff were skeptical, but they took him seriously because his physical presentation demanded that they do so. They admitted him. They ran tests. They took samples and scans and examinations. The results, when we were finally able to speak with people in authority, were inconclusive. There was nothing in the tests that could account for the physical changes they were observing. There was nothing in Liam's blood work that suggested any known infection or poison. There was nothing in his genetics that should have produced this kind of rapid physical alteration. But the changes continued. Over the course of 3 days, Liam transformed. His skin took on that mottled appearance entirely. His frame began to shift, his proportions becoming increasingly non-human. His mind seemed to be fragmenting. He would sometimes speak clearly about what had happened, and sometimes he would speak in that clicking, grinding language that the thing had used. On the 4th day, Liam stopped transforming. The changes seemed to have reached a stable point. He was still recognizably Liam, but only barely. His features had shifted significantly. His frame was altered. The amber eyes were permanent now, and they glowed slightly, even in bright light. When we were allowed to see him, he was in a private room with guards stationed outside. The hospital had contacted state authorities. The state authorities had contacted federal authorities. Liam had become something that existed in a gray area between human and not human, and nobody knew how to handle him. "I remember everything," Liam told us. His voice was still recognizably his voice, though there was something underneath it now, something that spoke in harmonics that human vocal cords should not be able to produce. "I can remember being myself, and I can remember the other thing. I can remember what it wanted. I can remember what it was trying to do. What was it trying to do? I asked. It was trying to replace me, Liam said. It was trying to become me completely. It was trying to understand what it meant to be human by absorbing a human, by integrating with a human, by becoming human through the process of absorbing humanity. It wanted to understand our fear. It wanted to understand our families. It wanted to understand what it meant to be one of us, to belong to a community, to have people who cared about you. But it could not do it, Liam continued, because we rejected it, because the rest of you did not let it take me completely, because your light, your attention, your refusal to be separated prevented the transformation from going all the way. I am trapped now in this in-between space. I am neither what I was nor what it intended for me to be. I am something new, something the world has never seen before. The state of West Virginia requested that we return for an official inquiry. We were questioned about our account of events, about what we had seen and heard, about the equipment Emma had been recording with. Emma's recordings were confiscated immediately. The audio evidence of the voices, the sounds the creature had made, the shriek when Liam shone the flashlight on it, all of that was taken by officials who did not explain what they would do with it. We were told that our story was concerning but not verifiable. Liam's physical state was attributed to an unknown progressive condition, something for the medical establishment to study but not something that could be explained in any public forum. We were instructed not to speak about what had happened, not to release any footage or images, not to discuss Liam's condition with anyone. We returned to our lives in our town, but we could not fully return. Something had changed in all of us. The way we moved through the world was different. We were more aware of shadows. We were more aware of sounds that did not belong. We were more aware that the world was larger and more complex and more dangerous than we had been taught to believe. 2 months after the incident, Liam's family moved away. They left the state, seeking better medical facilities in another region, seeking a place where Liam could be treated without the scrutiny of state authorities. Before he left, he requested that I be allowed to see him one final time. I went to their house on a cold December morning. Liam was in the basement, in a room that had been specifically prepared for him. The walls were reinforced. The windows were barred. Liam sat in the center of the room, and he looked at me with those amber eyes, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness for what he had become and what he had lost. "I am writing something," he said. "I am writing the full account of what happened, what I experienced, what I still experience. I wanted you to have it. I wanted someone to know the truth." He gave me a journal, a thick leather-bound notebook filled with his handwriting, pages and pages of accounts and details and analysis. The handwriting started out completely normal and became increasingly difficult to read as the pages went on, the letters becoming more angular and strange, until by the end it was almost unreadable, the script transforming into something that was barely language at all. "There is a reason," Liam said, "that those stories exist. There is a reason that cultures all over the world have stories about creatures that wear the faces of humans, about things that live in the darkness, about entities that hunger for something they cannot name. Those stories exist because the encounters are real, because the threat is real, because there are things in the wild places of the world that are older than human civilization, and they are curious about us." "Will you be okay?" I asked. "I do not know," Liam said. "My body is stable, but my mind is fragmenting. I can feel the presence of the thing that changed me, even though the physical transformation has stopped. I can feel it in my thoughts sometimes, suggesting ideas that are not my own, showing me perspectives that are not human. I do not know if I am still Liam or if I am becoming something else slowly, day by day." I left his house and I drove away, and I did not speak to Liam again. His family moved and left no forwarding address. Liam became a person from my past, someone I had known, someone who had transformed, someone who had become something that existed in the liminal spaces between the world I knew and the wild darkness beyond. But the effect of the encounter continued. Over the months following our return, each of us who had been there experienced strange phenomena. Emma developed an ability to understand languages she had never studied. She could read books in Arabic and understand them without translation. She could listen to conversations in languages from around the world and somehow comprehend them, as though the encounter had opened some part of her mind that had been closed before. William found that he could sense things that were wrong in ways that he could not explain. He would walk into a room and feel an almost physical pressure indicating that something was not right. Something was wounded or damaged in a way that went beyond the visible. He developed an uncanny ability to diagnose mechanical failures before they occurred. A car he was working on would suddenly feel wrong to him, and he would start pulling it apart, finding the flaw that was beginning to develop, preventing failures that might have injured him. Olivia developed photographic memory, not gradually, but completely. Within a week of returning home, she could recall every word she had ever read with perfect clarity. Every conversation she had ever had was available to her in full detail. She could relive memories with such clarity that it was like living through them again. This gift became a curse because she could not forget anything, even things she desperately wanted to forget. Isabella found that her ability to assess the physical condition of patients became almost supernatural. She could walk into a room and immediately know what was wrong with a person, even without running tests or asking questions. She could see beneath the skin somehow, could sense the way a body was failing in ways that modern medicine would take hours to discover. The rest of us experienced similar changes, though less dramatic. We found ourselves better than we had been in small ways, faster, stronger, more aware. Ava found that she could sense other people's emotions with startling accuracy. Noah found that he could repair things with greater skill and precision than he had previously possessed. Sophia found that she could organize information in her mind in ways that allowed her to solve complex problems with ease. Benjamin found that his body no longer seemed to suffer from fatigue in the same way. William and I found that we could see in lower light conditions than should have been possible. We all understood, without ever discussing it, that the encounter had marked us. The creature had touched us all in some way, had altered us all to some degree. We had survived something that should have killed us or changed us completely, and we had been left different for the experience. Emma eventually published a book about the encounter, though she carefully removed identifying information about the location and ourselves. The book was marketed as fiction, as a story rather than a true account. Most people read it as fiction and enjoyed it as fiction. Some people recognized the truth in it. Some people became obsessed with finding the real location, with finding the creature we had encountered, with trying to replicate the experience. We encouraged people not to look for it. We tried to warn people through every possible means that there were places in the wilderness where human beings should not venture, that there were creatures that should be left alone, that the price of encounter was not worth the price of knowledge. Years have passed since that camping trip in Point Pleasant. I am an adult now. I have my own life, my own responsibilities. I have tried to move forward, to accept what happened as something from my past that I cannot change. But the encounter has never truly left me. It is there in my bones. It is there in the way I move through the world. It is there in the way I respond to darkness and sounds that do not belong. I have tried many times to explain what I experienced that night and that day to people who were not there. I have tried to make them understand the reality of what we encountered, the objective nature of the threat that exists in the wild places. Most people do not believe me. They think it is a story, an exaggeration, a fabrication that I have created for some purpose I do not quite understand. I do not blame them. If I had not experienced it directly, if I did not carry the marks of that experience in my own transformed self, I would not believe it either. But I want to offer a warning to anyone who listens to this account. There are places in the world, particularly in the Appalachian region, particularly in the areas around Point Pleasant and the vast wilderness that surrounds it, where something ancient and something other makes its home. This entity, which the skinwalker stories of various cultures are trying to describe, exists at the margins of human civilization. It exists in the places where the wild has not yet been fully tamed, where the darkness still holds dominion. This entity is curious. It is intelligent. It is capable of deception. It wants to understand humanity, but it does not understand humanity in a way that we would recognize. It wants to know what it is like to have family, to have community, to have continuity of identity across time. These are things that the entity seems to lack, and it hungers for them. The voices you might hear in the darkness, calling names you recognize, offering help and comfort and rescue, are not the help and comfort of people who love you. They are the mimicry of something that is trying to lure you from safety. They are the songs of a predator disguised in the melody of your own life. If you hear such voices, do not answer. Do not investigate. Do not try to respond or engage. Stay in the light. Stay with people who can verify that they are who they claim to be. Stay together, and do not allow yourselves to be separated into the darkness. The creature that we encountered that night was not unique. The folklore of the skinwalker exists across multiple cultures because multiple peoples have encountered this phenomenon. It exists in the mountains of Appalachia. It exists in the wild places beyond the borders of civilization. It exists in the forests and the canyons and the remote places where human beings have not fully established dominion. And it is still there. It is still hunting. It is still trying to understand humanity by becoming human, by absorbing human consciousness, by transforming itself through the process of merger with our kind. Liam was only partially successful from the creature's perspective. He was not fully transformed. He remained partially himself. But he was changed nonetheless, and he suffered for it. He carries a burden that no human being should have to carry. I have seen him twice since that first encounter. Both times he was further along in his transformation. The amber of his eyes had spread slightly into the whites. The modeling of his skin had become more pronounced. He was becoming something other, something hybrid, something that belonged fully to neither his human past nor to the creature that had tried to consume him. When I asked him if he regretted going on the camping trip, his response was honest. "I regret many things," he said. "I regret that I did not listen to my instincts when they were telling me to turn back. I regret that I did not take the warnings more seriously. I regret that I was so convinced of my own invulnerability that I did not understand the danger. But I do not regret the experience itself. I do not regret that I survived it, because I am still myself. I am still Liam, even though I am changing. I am still the person that people can point to and say, look, he went into the darkness and he came back. He went into the wilderness and he encountered something unknowable and he survived it." But survival, I have come to understand, is not the same thing as coming out unscathed. We all survived. But we all carry marks from the experience that we will never be able to fully remove. Emma still records. She still documents the paranormal. She has become something of an expert on skinwalker phenomena, and she has compiled an extensive database of historical accounts and contemporary reports. She is trying to understand the entity, to classify it, to find some way to predict its behavior. Liam's transformation has continued. The last I heard, his family was exploring the possibility of him living more permanently in an isolated location, where he could be himself without the scrutiny of a human society that does not know how to accommodate someone like him. And I continue forward, carrying the knowledge of what exists beyond the boundaries of the known world, carrying the awareness that the darkness is deeper and stranger and more alive than most people are willing to believe. I am telling you this because I believe you deserve to know the truth. I believe you deserve to understand that the folklore warnings that our ancestors handed down to us were based on experience. They were trying to tell us something important. They were trying to keep us safe. And as we have abandoned these stories, as we have dismissed them as superstition, we have lost the protection that these stories were meant to provide. Do not venture into the wilderness unprepared. Do not approach the dark places with an attitude of invulnerability or skepticism. Do not assume that the world operates according to the rules that you have been taught, because there are places where those rules do not apply. There are places where something other has dominion. There are places where humanity is not the dominant force. And if you find yourself in such a place, if you find yourself hearing voices in the darkness, if you find yourself facing something that should not exist, remember what I have told you. Remember that light is a defense. Remember that community is a defense. Remember that refusing to be separated is a defense. The skinwalker will call to you. It will use the voices of your loved ones. It will try to convince you that rescue is coming, that help is near, that you should step into the darkness to find safety. Do not believe it. Stay in the light. Stay together. Stay human. Because once you allow the darkness to take you, once you allow the thing from beyond the boundaries of the known world to touch you and change you, you may survive, but you will never be the same. You will be transformed. And transformation, my friends, is a burden that no human being should have to carry. This is the truth of what happened to us. This is the warning that I am leaving for anyone who comes after. And this is the account of the night we walked into the darkness and the darkness walked back with us.